Chapter 11. In the hurly-burly of the rearrangement of life, nobody had been able to pay much attention to Stephen, and he had revelled in this freedom from supervision. He had always steered his small, hard life on a line of his own, a line he strove to make parallel to the course of the rest of the family and never intersecting. Contact with others always meant trouble in Stephen's experience, except with Henry and Helen. Now that the grown-ups had almost forgotten his existence, he was enjoying life as never before, under his dirty, crumpled rompers, stiff with spilled egg yolk and cold bacon grease. His father's accident had made no impression on his emotions. Events that did not touch Stephen personally never made any impression on his emotions. The only element in the new situation which interested him was that Mother seemed to have forgotten all about Teddy. This was important. It made Stephen very glad that Father had fallen off the roof and broken his legs all up, or whatever it was. As long as Father stayed in bed, he couldn't bother anybody, even when he and Stephen were left alone. For after a time, they were left alone. When the sick man began to improve, so that he was conscious and later occasionally out of pain, there were hours when the round of volunteer neighbors and helpers thinned out, when he was left in his bed in the dining room, a glass of water, a book, something to eat, and the desk telephone on a table by his side, with instructions to telephone if he needed anything. "Don't you hesitate a minute now, Mr. Knapp," said old Mrs. Hennessy heartily. "If it's no more than to put a shovelful of coal on the kitchen fire. You call 14, ring 32, and I'll be right over. And when Stephen gets to acting up, just shake the window curtain real hard, and I'll drop everything and come over and settle him," said Mrs. Anderson zestfully. So far, Stephen had not acted up. Probably, so Mrs. Anderson told Mrs. Knapp, because as things are now, he's let to do just what he pleases, and goodness knows what that is. Stephen had even been a stimulating element in his father's days, when they first began to emerge from the endless nightmare of pain, and to become, once more, successive stages in a human life. Lester never spoke to anyone about those first weeks after his fall, and thought of them himself as little as possible. The mere casual mention of them afterwards brought the cold sweat out on him. No circle in any hell would have contained more concentrated suffering than was crowded into his every conscious moment. Horrible, brute, physical suffering, tearing at every nerve. Suffering that degraded him, that left him no humanity. When this was deadened for an instant by opiates or exhaustion, there were terrible hallucinations. He was once again on the steep icy roof, turning, death in his heart, to throw himself down into cold nothingness. He was falling, endlessly falling. And now he knew what intolerable anguish awaited him at the end of his fall. He screamed out dreadfully at such times, and tore at the bedclothes as if to save himself. These moments of frenzy always ended by his coming to himself with a great start, and finding himself burning and raging once more in unendurable physical pain. Later, once in a while, there were fleeting instants, almost of lucidity, during which, as he was flung through space by the whirlwind of that inhuman, impersonal agony, he yet caught glimpses, as it were, of his own personality, lying there, prone, waiting for him to come back to enter it. This half-consciousness always brought the same thought to him. Poor, weak wretch, he had not even force enough to kill himself. He thought it as of someone else, half pityingly, half contemptuously. Then came periods of freedom from pain, incredulous, breathless bliss, poisoned by his horrified apprehension of being touched, for the slightest touch, even of the bed, plunged him again into that abyss. During one of those respites, when he lay scarcely daring to breathe, there came to him the first personal sensation since his fall. He chanced to lie with his head turned towards the room, and for a moment he saw it as it was, a part of human life, and not merely the background for this endless dying of his. On the floor sat Stephen, very dirty and uncared for, playing with his teddy bear. The expression on his face reminded Lester of something. Something, it seemed, which had begun, something with which he had wanted to go on, but just then Eva had brushed his pillow, and this glimpse back into the human life out of which he had hurled himself vanished in the molten lava of his physical pain. Little by little, some unsuspected and implacable vitality hidden in his body slowly pushed him, groaning and unwilling, out of the living death which he still so passionately desired to make dead death. The weeks passed. He suffered less. He lay passive and empty, staring up at the ceiling, counting and cataloguing all the small blemishes and stains in the plaster. A little strength seeped slowly back into his body. One day he found that he could read for a few moments at a time. He became aware of the life that went on about him. Chiefly it was Stephen's life, because Stephen was generally in the foreground of the room. Lester began to look down at the child as he played about on the floor, watched languidly the expression on his round pugnacious face, almost always dirty now, but, so it seemed to his father, not always so darkly grim as he remembered it. But then he thought again, one of the slow thoughts which occasionally pushed their way up to his attention. He had never seen Stephen except in active conflict with authority. "I never saw one of my children just living before," he meditated. As he lay in bed, a book was usually open before him, but he looked over it at the far more interesting spectacle of his undiscovered little boy. His first voluntary move back towards life was on the day when he had his talk with Stephen about his Teddy. It began by his remembering suddenly what it had been which had begun and with which he had wanted to go on. The little memory presenting itself so abruptly out of his subconsciousness startled him into saying impulsively, "Oh, Stephen, come here a minute. What was it you started to tell me that day, up in the bathroom when I was shaving, about your Teddy?" The moment he had spoken, he realized how foolish that question was. The day seemed like yesterday to him, because there had been only blackness for him ever since. But it was 2 months ago, and 2 months for a little boy. How could he have thought that Stephen would remember? But as a matter of fact, Stephen looked as though he remembered very well indeed. He had started at the word Teddy, had turned instantly suspicious eyes on his father, and had made a clutch at the stuffed bear, over whose head he now stared at the man in bed, silently, his mouth a hard line, with the dogged expression of resistance which was so familiar. Lester's enforced observation of Stephen made this pantomime intelligible to him in part. Stephen was afraid something would happen to Teddy. Why in the world should he be afraid? On this question he put his attention, watching Stephen closely, as he said laughingly, "What's the matter with you, old man? Do you think I want to take Teddy away to play with him myself?" Stephen's face relaxed a very little at this. His eyes searched his father's, deeply and gravely, with an intense, wary seriousness, as a white traveller lost in a jungle amongst savages might search the eyes of one of the tribe who had offered a friendly aspect. Could he be trusted? Or was this just another of their cannibalistic wiles? "I like your Teddy fine," continued Lester conversationally. "I always liked the way he snuggles up to you in your bed. I used to wake up and look over at him sometimes. But I'm afraid I'm too old to play with him myself." At the mention of Teddy sleeping beside him, Stephen looked away and down into the bright opaque eyes of his fetish, and as he did this his father felt an acute shock of surprise. The child's face was passionately tender and loving. He looked as his own mother had looked when she held her first baby in her arms. Lester was so astonished that he was obliged to wait a moment before he could command his voice to casual negligence. "So you don't remember what it was you were going to ask me about, Teddy," he said presently. "Well, it was quite a while ago." So far he had not induced Stephen to say a single word. That was always Stephen's way of resisting talk and persuasion and attempts to reach him. Lester held his book up again and waited. He waited a long time. But waiting was one thing which circumstances made easy for him. There was little else a paralyzed man could do. Stephen sat motionless, his face a blank, staring into space. His father felt the uncertainty and questioning going on under that self-protective front of stolidity. Presently, a long time afterwards, the little boy got up and came slowly towards his father's bed. "Yes, I remember what it was," he said in a low tone, keeping his eyes fixed intently on the expression of his father's face. "I wanted to ask you not to let Mother—" His voice dropped to a solemn, quavering whisper. "Not to let Mother wash Teddy." Lester survived the entire and grotesque unexpectedness of this with no more sign of his amazement than a flicker of his eyelids. He considered a dozen different ways of advancing into this undiscovered country, and rejected them all in favor of the neutral question, was Mother going to wash Teddy? At this it all came out in a storm. The visit to the lady, the horrible, misshapen, shrunken Teddy there, Mother stealing Teddy away in the night, the devouring dread in Stephen's mind, a dread so great that it now overcame even his fierce pride and his anger, as he sobbed out at the last, "Don't let him be washed, Father! Don't let him!" He raised his streaming eyes agonizingly towards his father, his whole face quivering. Lester was so horrified that for a moment he could not speak. He was horrified to see Stephen reduced so low. He was more horrified at the position in which he found himself, absolute arbiter over another human being, a being who had no recourse, no appeal from his decisions. It was indecent, he thought. It sinned against human dignity, both his and the child's. "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master," he cried to himself, shamed to the core by Stephen's helpless dependence on his whim, a dependence of which Stephen was so tragically aware. All his stern bulwarks of anger and resistance broken down by the extremity of his fear for what he loved. Fear for himself would never so have transfigured Stephen, never. Lester understood this. More, he felt it himself. Felt himself ready to fight for Stephen as Stephen had been ready to fight for Teddy. He, Lester, who had never felt that he had the right to fight for anything of his own. His gaze on the child had passion in it as he said firmly, weightily, "I'll never have anything done to your Teddy that you don't want, Stephen. He's yours. You've got the right to have the say-so about him." Stephen looked at his father blindly, as if he did not understand these strange words. But though they were unfamiliar, though he could not understand them, they gave him hope. "You won't have him washed?" he asked, clinging to the one point he understood. "Not washed, or anything else if you don't want it," said his father, reiterating his own point. It seemed to him he could not live another day if he did not succeed in making Stephen understand that. To his astonishment, and again to his shame, Stephen burst out with a phrase which had never before passed his lips except under protest. "Oh, thank you, Father! Oh, thank you!" he cried loudly, his lips trembling. Lester found the child's relief shocking. It made him sick to think what dread must have preceded it. What a fathomless blackness of uncertainty in Stephen's life it must represent. He spoke roughly, almost as he would to another man. "You don't have to thank me, Stevie," he said. "Great Scott, old boy, it's none of my business what you do with your own Teddy, is it?" Even as he spoke, like a lurid side glimpse, was it possible that there were people who would enjoy thanks extorted on these infamous terms? Were they ever set over children? His insistence seemed to have penetrated a little way through Stephen's lifelong experience of the nature of things. The little boy stood looking at him, his face serious and receptive, as if a new idea were dawning on him. It was so new that he did not seem to know what to do with it, and in a moment turned away and sat down on the floor again. He reached for his Teddy and sat clasping him in his lap. The two were silent, father and son. Lester said to himself, shivering, "What a ghastly thing, to have sensitive, helpless human beings absolutely in the power of other human beings. Absolute, unquestioned power. Nobody can stand that. It's cold poison. How many wardens of prisons are driven sadistically mad with it?" He recoiled from it in terror. You'd have to be a Superman to be equal to it. In the silent room he heard it echoing solemnly. That's what it is to be a parent. He had been a parent for 13 years before he thought of it. He looked over the edge of his bed at Stephen and abased himself silently. The child sat motionless, clasping Teddy, his face bent and turned away so that Lester could not see its expression. His attitude was that of someone thinking deeply. Well, reflected Lester, there was certainly good reason for the taking of thought by everybody concerned. He let his head fall back on the pillow, and staring up, began, for the first time since his fall, to think connectedly about something other than his own wretchedness. For the first time, the ugly blemishes on the ceiling were not like blotches in his own brain. Presently he forgot about them altogether. The sudden contact with Stephen's utterly unsuspected suffering had been like dropping his fingers unawares upon a red-hot iron. His reaction had been the mere reflex of the intolerable pain it gave him. Now, in the long quiet of his sick room, he set himself to try to understand what it meant. So that had been at the bottom of Stephen's fierceness and badness in those last days of the old life. So it had been black despair which had filled the child's heart, and not merely an inexplicable desire to make trouble for his mother. For heaven's sakes, how far off the track they had been! But however could they have guessed at the real cause of the trouble? What had possessed the child to keep such a perverse silence? Why hadn't he told somebody? How could they know if he never said a word? He thought again of the scene in the bathroom that last morning, and saw again Stephen's wistful face looking up into his. Stephen had tried to tell him, and those sacred itemized accounts of Willing's Emporium had stopped his mouth. But Evangeline was always on hand. Why hadn't Stephen... Without a word, with a complete perception that filled all his consciousness, Lester knew why Stephen had never tried to tell his mother. And yet, his sense of fairness made him take up the cudgels for Eva. It hadn't been such an unreasonable idea of hers. Teddy was certainly as dirty as it was possible for anything to be. You have to keep children clean, whether they like it or not. Suppose Teddy had been played with by a child who had scarlet fever, they'd have to have him cleaned, wouldn't they? He had gone too far, yielded to a melodramatic impulse when he promised Stephen so solemnly that they would never have anything done to Teddy that he didn't like. But as a matter of fact, Teddy never had been near scarlet fever or anything else contagious. And even if he had, weren't there ways of dry cleaning and disinfecting that would leave the personality of the toy intact? You didn't have to soak it in a tub of soapy water. What was the matter with wrapping it in an old cloth and baking it in the oven, as you do with bandages you want to sterilize? If anybody had had the slightest idea that Stephen felt as he did. But nobody had, and that was the point. He saw it now. Nothing turned on the question of whether Teddy should or should not be cleaned. That was a purely practical matter that could have been arranged by a little practical ingenuity, if it had occurred to anybody that there was anything to arrange. The question really was, why had it not occurred to anybody? What was terrifying to Lester was the thought that the conception of trying to understand Stephen's point of view had been as remote from their minds as the existence of the fourth dimension. And even now that the violent shock of this little scene with Stephen had put the conception into his brain, how under the sun could you ever find out what was felt by a child who shut himself up so blackly in the stronghold of repellent silence? Why had Stephen so shut himself up? That question was as new to Lester as a question of the cause of the law of gravity. It had never occurred to him that perhaps Stephen had not been born that way. But even a sullen stronghold of badness was better than that dreadful breakdown of human dignity. Lester felt he could never endure it again to have Stephen look into his face with that slavish, helpless searching of his eyes. No self-respecting human being could bear that look from another. Could there be human beings, women, mothers, who fattened on it, fought to keep that slave's look in the eyes of their children? He turned from this thought with a start. Well, what good did all this thinking do him, or Stephen? What could he do now, at once, to escape out of this prison and take Stephen with him? With a heat of anger, he told himself that at least he could start in to make Stephen feel, hour by hour, in every contact with him, that he, even a little boy, had some standing in the world, inviolable by grown-ups. Yes, sacred even to parents. He breathed hard and flung out his arm. For the first time he desired to get well, to live again. End of section 11. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 12. Helen and Henry Knapp were skipping home from school hand in hand to the tune of "Skippity-hop to the barber shop to buy a stick of candy, one for you and one for me and one for—" They were interrupted by their Aunt Mattie Farnham, who ran out of the house and pounced on them. "For goodness sakes, Henry and Helen, tell me about your folks. I've been worried to death about you all." She stopped, looked down at the new black dress she wore, and said with a decent sigh, "My poor Aunt Emma passed away a week ago, you know. The funeral was the day before yesterday, and I just got home this morning." The children tried, not very successfully, to put on a decent soberness to match her sigh, and were silent, not knowing what comment to make. They had, as a matter of fact, heard, although they had long since forgotten it, that Aunt Mattie had been called away clear up to Maine by a telegram announcing the sickness of her husband's old aunt. Usually they missed Aunt Mattie fearfully when she was away from town, but this time the 2 months of her absence had been filled far too full with other events. Due respect to the abstract idea of death having been paid, after their fashion, by each of the three, they re-entered ordinary life with the exclamation from Aunt Mattie, "Now, do tell me how ever in the living world you've managed. How do you get along? I haven't heard a thing. Not really to say heard. Mr. Farnham means to do all right, but he's no hand at writing letters. I'd write and ask him about 1,000,000 questions about you all, and all he'd write back would be some little smitch of news and a lot about the weather. He did tell me that your mamma has got a job down at Willings and is doing fine. She would. She's a wonderful woman, your mamma is. Everybody knows that. But how ever do you manage, with your poor mamma away all day and your papa the way he is? How is he? Awful bad?" Her kind, fair face bent anxiously towards them. It was again as if the children tried, not very successfully, to put on a decent soberness to match her expression. They hesitated as if they did not know exactly what was decorous to say. Then Helen murmured, "Father was awfully bad at first, they said. Mother sent us children off to Branville to stay with Grandma and Grandpa Houghton, so we didn't know anything about that first part. But Grandma got sick and we had to come home, and Father was lots better by that time." "But how do you manage?" queried Aunt Mattie again. "How can you, with your poor mamma away? I never thought that house could run a minute without her. She did everything." "Oh, we manage all right," said Helen. "Father and us children keep the house." "Your father? I thought he was in bed." "No, he's able to be up in a wheelchair now. The janitor of the store's old father had a wheelchair, and they didn't sell it after he died, and it was up attic, and he brought it to Father. He said Father had helped him out at the store when his little boy was sick. Oh, lots of the folks from the store have come to help out. The delivery driver, he said he couldn't ever forget what Father did for him one time. He won't tell what it was because he's ashamed, only he wanted to help out, too. And as long as we had to have a furnace fire, he came in every morning and night to look out for the furnace. And he steps in daytimes now when he's going by to see if everything's all right. And old Mrs. Hennessy, she's the cleaning woman, she kept coming all the time to help and bring in things to eat, pies, you know. She came in nights and mornings, when Father was so bad, to do up the work, and wouldn't take any pay for it. She doesn't have to now, to do the work, I mean, but she still does the washing, only we pay her, of course." Aunt Mattie's look of bewilderment sharpened to distraction. "You have only got me more mixed up than ever," she cried vacantly. "Mercy me. The furnace, the washings. Yes, I see about those. But all the rest. The meals, the housework, Stephen. When I think of how your poor mother slaved to—" She looked at them almost sternly, as if suspecting them of levity. Henry said, "Father and all of us get along. You see, Father's all right now, only his legs. He can do anything except walk. And Helen and I do the walking for him." Mrs. Farnham made an exasperated gesture at their refusal to take in her meaning. "Who does the cooking?" she shouted desperately, getting down to bedrock. "Father does. We all do," said Helen. "Father's a lovely cook. He's learning out of a cookbook. And so am I. We're learning together." Aunt Mattie's face instantly smoothed into comprehension of everything. She had wondered how they managed without a woman to keep house for them, and now she knew. They didn't manage. "Oh," she said, and well. She looked at them compassionately. "I'll have to get over to your house as fast as ever I can," she said, as if to herself. As her eyes dwelt half absently on the children, she observed aloud, "Seems to me Henry's looking better, not so peaked. Did that pepsin treatment of Dr. Merritt's really do him some good? I never thought much of pepsin myself." The children looked at each other as if surprised by something they had not noticed before. "Why, Henry, that's so. You haven't had one of your sick spells for ever so long, have you?" said Helen. To Aunt Mattie she explained, "We've had so much else to think about we hadn't noticed." Mrs. Farnham rejected pepsin for another diagnosis. "I know what 'tis, that visit to your Grandma and Grandpa Houghton. I always told your mamma that what Henry needed was country air. There's nothing like a change of air, nothing." Helen said now, "We've got to run along, Aunt Mattie. We help about lunch. Father gets it ready, but we clear away and take Stephen out to play a while." "Oh, that reminds me. How about Stephen? How does your—" Her ingenuity was not enough to contrive a presentable form for her inquiry, but the child came to her rescue understandingly. "Why, Stephen seems to be growing out of those naughty streaks," said Helen. "He's lots better somehow. He still has a tantrum once in a while, but not nearly so often nor so bad. You see, he likes Father being sick." She knew how shocking this was on Stephen's part, and added apologetically, "He's so little, you know. He doesn't understand how terrible it is for poor Father. But Father tells him stories all the time almost, and Stephen loves them. Mother was always too busy to tell stories, you know." "Well, I should say so indeed," cried Aunt Mattie, outraged at the picture, even hypothetical, of poor Evangeline attempting to tell stories on top of everything else she had to do. "Step along with you children," she said now. "I hadn't ought to have kept you so long as 'tis. But I've been worrying my head off about you all. Tell your papa that I'm coming right over there this afternoon to see him just as soon as I get my trunk unpacked and things straightened around a little." End of Section 12. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 13. He that is down need fear no fall, he that is low no pride. said Lester Knapp aloud to himself. It was a great pleasure to him to be able to say the strong, short Saxon words aloud. For years he had been shutting into the cage of silence all the winged, beautiful words which came flying into his mind. And beautiful words, which you do not pronounce aloud, are like children always forced to be quiet and sit still. They droop and languish. But before this it would have been too foolish to repeat the lovely lines that came into his mind. What would Harvey Bronson have thought to hear the army of unalterable law pronounced in the office of Willing's Emporium? Lester Knapp smiled to himself at the idea. And if it hadn't been Harvey Bronson at hand, it would have been someone else just as scandalized. But now there was no one to hear. No one but little Stephen, playing with his toy train on the newspapers spread out over the floor. A blessed healing solitude lay about Lester as he sat in his wheelchair in the sunny kitchen, peeling a panful of potatoes. It had been when he looked down at the gingham apron spread over his paralyzed knees that the song of the little shepherd had come into his mind. A gingham apron on a man and peeling potatoes. He supposed that Harvey Bronson would die of shame if anybody put a gingham apron on him and expected him to peel potatoes. And yet there was nobody who talked louder than he about the sacred dignity of the home, which ennobled all the work done for its sake. That was for Mrs. Harvey Bronson, of course. Lester Knapp smiled again, his slow, whimsical smile, which Harvey Bronson especially detested and feared. Then he stopped thinking about his old associate at the office. The lines which had come into his mind brought with them all the world to which they belonged, the strong-hearted, simple, passionate world of the old cobbler pilgrim. Where were those lines? Towards the end of the book, wasn't it? Just below that quaint marginal note of "men thrive in the valley of humiliation." It was where the pilgrims were going. Yes, now he remembered the very words, with that exactitude of memory which had been such a golden thing in his life. They were going along talking, and espied a boy feeding his father's sheep. The boy was in very mean clothes, but of a fresh, well-favoured countenance, and as he sat by himself he sang. "Hark," said Mr. Greatheart, "to what the shepherd boy saith." So they hearkened. Lester Knapp, peeling his potatoes, hearkened with them, as he said aloud again, "He that is down need fear no fall, he that is low no pride. He that is humble ever shall have God to be his guide. I am content with what I have, little be it or much." He perceived that Stephen had stopped playing and was looking at him steadily as he said the words aloud. With a flourish of his paring knife he went on, smiling at the little boy. Then said the guide, "Do you hear him? I will dare to say that this boy lives a merrier life, and wears more of that herb called heart's ease in his bosom than he that is clad in silk and velvet." "Silk and velvet," he said, with a humorous scorn, lifting a fold of his gingham apron. "Is it a story?" asked Stephen, coming up beside his father's chair. "You bet your life it is a story, a crackerjack of a story." "Tell it to me," said Stephen. He leaned both elbows on the arm of the chair, put his round chin in his hands, tipped his head to one side, and turned his shining dark eyes up towards his father's face. A phrase came to Lester's mind, the description of the day when Bunyan had first seen the great invisible world, henceforth to be his heart's home, and how it had begun by his seeing in one of the streets of Bedford 3 or 4 poor people sitting at a door in the sun, talking of the things of God. He and Stephen were poor people too, sitting in the sun, such golden sunshine as came through the window into the quiet room and fell on the head of his little boy. "Well, Stephen, once upon a time there was a man," he began, deciding that the rolling off of the burden and the fight with Apollyon were most in Stephen's line. He wondered if he could find in the old story stuff to interest a modern little boy, and in a moment was carried away by it. What a tale it was! how full of pith and meat and savor. The potatoes were all peeled before he finished the story of the fight, so that he laid down his paring knife and turned entirely to Stephen as they came to the climax. They had adventured down the terrible valley of death, and were now in the hand-to-hand combat. Cut, slash, forward, back. Then Apollyon began to gather up close to Christian, and wrestling with him, gave him a dreadful fall, and with that Christian's sword flew out of his hand. He paused dramatically. Stephen's wide eyes grew wider. His lips were parted. He did not seem to breathe, all his being suspended on his father's words. It was plain he had forgotten where he was or who. Then said Apollyon, "I am sure of thee now," said Leicester, and Stephen shivered. But Christian reached out quick, and snatched up his sword, and ran it deep into that horrible old Apollyon, and made him stagger back to get his breath. And then Christian scrambled up on his feet and ran at the dragon, shouting. And with that Apollyon spread out his dragon wings and sped him away, and Christian saw him no more. Stephen drew a long breath. "Golly," he said fervently. "Yes, I should say as much," agreed his father, pushing his chair over to the stove and dropping the potatoes into the boiling water. How exciting it was, he thought, how absorbing, to see those first impressions of power and courage touch a new human soul, and when it was your own little boy, to share with him one of the immortal fine things created by the human spirit. He sat still for a moment, remembering the book, soaking himself in its flavor and color, tasting some of the quaint posy-like phrases. Some things are of that nature as to make one's fancy chuckle while his heart doth ache. Harvey Bronson, for instance. And some people are never for religion until it walks with silver slippers in the sunshine. Was that Mr. Prouty? Still musing, he wheeled himself into the dining room and began to set the table for lunch. Through the clicking of the silver, Stephen could hear him say, "His daughter went through the dark river singing, but none could understand what she said. None could understand what she said." It sounded like a song to Stephen, although father was only talking to himself. When he came out again into the kitchen and began to slice the bacon, he was saying in a loud, strong voice, "So he passed over, and all the trumpets sounded for him on the other side. All the trumpets sounded." The words rang in Stephen's ears. He said them over to himself in a murmur as he handled his top absently. All the trumpets sounded. All the trumpets sounded on the other side. After a time he asked, "Father, what's a trumpet?" A question from Stephen. His father turned his head from the frying pan, from which the bacon sent up its thin blue wreaths of smoke. "What's a trumpet? It's a great gleaming brass horn, which always has been blown where there has been a victory. Like this." He flung up his arm, holding an imaginary trumpet to his lips. "Taranta, taranta." He sounded it out ringingly. That's the way they sounded when Mr. Valiant crossed the dark river. "Ta-ta," murmured Stephen to himself, and all the trumpets sounded. He sat in the sun on the kitchen floor, looking up at his crippled father frying bacon. For both of them the kitchen was ringing with the bright brazen shout of victory. Men thrive in the valley of humiliation. End of section 13. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 14. Leicester was glad to see Mattie Farnham come bustling in the very afternoon of the day she returned from Maine. He liked Mattie. Indeed, he almost loved her, in spite of the fact that so far as he had been able to ascertain, she had never yet understood anything he ever said to her. They did not use at all the same vocabulary, but they held friendly communication by means of sign language, like a dog and cat who have grown up in the same house and have an old affection for each other. "Hello there, Matty," he welcomed her as she entered. "How are the potatoes in Maine? Ours have spots in them." It amused him with Matty to disconcert her decent sense of what was the suitable attitude to strike. He knew that both she and her husband were relieved to have their 90-year-old bedridden aunt safely and painlessly in the next world, blessed if he'd go through the motions of condoling with her. But he saw at once that he had shocked, not her sense of the proper attitude about Aunt Emma, but about himself. She had come over prepared to sympathize with him. Matty always had to go through the proper motions. "How are you getting on, Lester?" she asked earnestly, with her best Ladies' Guild flatness of intonation. "You can't imagine how I have worried about you and poor Eva and the dear children. I've been sick to think I wasn't here to help out in this sad time. Now I'm back, you must let me do everything I can." "You might come and call on Stephen and me once in a while and bring us some of your famous home cooking," he suggested mischievously. She laughed, in spite of herself, at his jibe over her weakness for delicatessen potato salad. "You miserable sinner," she cried, in her own voice, dropping for an instant into their old joking relationship. She sobered at once, however, into what Lester called to himself the mourners waiting for the benediction manner, and said, "I was planning as I walked over how I could arrange my own work to have 2 hours free every afternoon and come here to do for you." "You'll find it all done," he told her genially. "You can't beat me to it. Come along all the same, and we'll play cribbage." She was perplexed as well as shocked by his levity, and at last simply threw herself on his mercy. "Lester, do tell me all about things," she said, in an honest human tone of affection and concern, which brought from him an answer in kind. "Well, Matty, I will. It was hell at first, all the kinds of hell there are, but you know how folks are, how you get used to everything, and I got better, got so it didn't make me faint away with pain to have somebody touch the bed, and then, little by little, I settled down to where I am now. Both legs incurably paralyzed, I'm told, but the rest of me is all right. In the meantime, Eva, you know how Eva never lies down and gives up. As soon as I could be left, she hustled right out and got a job. She's in the cloak and suits at Willings now, and making good money. What with her commissions on extra sales, she's making just about what I did, with the promise of a good raise soon. The Willings have treated her very white, I must say, and I imagine she's the wonder of the world as a saleswoman." "She would be at anything," breathed Matty devoutly. "She surely would," agreed her husband heartily. "Well, here at the house we've shuffled things around into a new pattern, and we're getting on. I can do anything that needs to be done on this floor, with Henry and Helen's help, and the doctor says I'll soon be on crutches and able to get up the stairs once a day. It seemed queer to be doing housework, but there isn't another mortal thing I can do but keep things running, so I do." "Poor Lester," said Matty, just as he knew she would. "Not on your life," he told her. "I don't mind the work a bit, now I've got used to the idea. I can't say it's exactly enlivening to be tied up to half your body that's dead but not buried, but I haven't got anything else to complain of. As to the housework, I haven't had such a good time in years. You know what an absent-minded scut I am, with my head always full of odds and ends of book junk I like to mull over. Well, housework doesn't interfere with thinking, as account-keeping does, believe me. I can start my hands and arms to washing dishes or peeling potatoes or setting the table, and then leave them to do the job while I roam from China to Peru. Every time I tried that at the office, the bottom dropped out. Here I've more time for thinking and for reading, too, in the evenings. The children bring the books to me from the library." "Well, it's very brave of you to take it that way, I'm sure," said Matty, with a decent sigh of sympathy. He thought to himself with exasperation that Matty's mental indolence was invincible. She never made the slightest effort of her own accord to escape from the rubber-stamp formula in which she had been brought up. By lively joshing, you could occasionally jolt her into a spontaneous perception of her own, but the minute you stopped, she sank back and pulled the cover of the Ladies' Guild mummy case over her. And she was so human under it, one of the most human people he had ever met. As he was thinking all this, by no means for the first time in his life, she caught out of the corner of her eye a glimpse of something in the kitchen, over which she now exclaimed in amazement, "What in the name of time is all that litter of papers on the kitchen floor?" "All that litter?" he protested. "That's not litter. That is an original exercise of the human intelligence in contact with real life. You encounter so few of those, you don't recognize one when you meet it. That is one of the patented inventions of the Knapp family, Incorporated." She looked at him dumbly with the patient expression of bewilderment, which always brought him to time. He began to explain, literally and explicitly. "We have executive sessions, the children and I, to figure out ways and means to cope with life and not get beaten by small details. We all got together on this floor proposition. We put it to ourselves this way. The kitchen floor has to be scrubbed to keep it clean. None of us are smart enough to scrub it. What's the answer? Of course, Eva must simply do nothing whatever about the house. The doctor issued an ultimatum about that. She has all she can do at the store. Well, you wouldn't believe it, but Stephen got the answer. He said, 'When I paint with my watercolors, Mother always spreads papers down on the floor.' Done. The attic was piled to the eaves with old newspapers. Every day Helen or Henry brings down a fresh supply. We spread them around 2 or 3 thick, drop our grease on them with all the peace of mind in the world, whisk them up at night before Eva comes in, and have a spotless floor to show her. What's the matter with that?" "Why, I never heard of such a thing in my life," cried Mattie. People seem to think, reflected Lester, that they make an all-sufficient comment when they say that. She got up now and walked to the kitchen door to gaze down on the paper. "That's a sample of the way we do business," said Lester to her back. He wheeled himself over to the table and took out of a work-basket a pair of Stephen's little stockings, which he prepared to darn. Mattie turned, saw what he was doing, and pounced on him with shocked, peremptory benevolence. "Oh, Lester, let me do that. The idea of your darning stockings. It's dreadful enough your having to do the housework." "Eva darned them a good many years," he said with some warmth, "and did the housework. Why shouldn't I?" He looked at her hard and went on. "Do you know what you're saying to me, Mattie Farnham? You're telling me that you really think that home-making is a poor, mean, cheap job, beneath the dignity of anybody who can do anything else." Mattie Farnham was for a moment helpless with shock over his attack. When she slowly rose to a comprehension of what he had said, she shouted indignantly, "Lester Knapp! How dare you say such a thing? I never dreamed of having such an awful idea." She brought out a formula again, but this time with heartfelt personal conviction. "Home-making is the noblest work anybody can do." "Why pity me, then?" asked Lester with a grin, drawing his needle in and out of the little stocking. "Well, but—" she said breathlessly, and was silent. There was a pause. Then she asked, meekly, climbing down with relief from the abstruse and unfamiliar abstract to the friendly concrete, "However in the world did you learn to darn, Lester?" "Out of a book," he told her tranquilly. "While I was still in bed, I sent to the library for any books they had on housekeeping. They sent me some corking ones, as good reading as ever I saw." "Why, I didn't know they had books about housekeeping at the library," said Mattie, who was a great reader of novels. "I bet I know more about cooking than you do this minute," he said, laughing at her. "Why do you put your flour for a cream sauce into the butter and cook it before you add the milk?" "I don't," she said, astonished. "I heat my milk and mix my flour with a little cold water and—" "Well, you're wrong," he said authoritatively. "That's not the best way. The flour isn't thoroughly cooked. Fat can be heated many degrees hotter than water. Mattie Farnham felt herself sinking deeper and deeper into a stupid bewilderment. Was it really Lester Knapp with whom she sat discussing recipes? She had come over to sympathize and condole with him. However in the living world had she been switched off to cream sauce? She got up, shook herself, and took a step or two around the room. "Don't go looking to see if the furniture is dusted or the floor polished," said Lester calmly. "We concentrate on the important things in our house and let the non-essentials go." "I wasn't thinking about dust," she told him, exasperated, although she had been. And then, struck by a sudden thought, "Where's Stephen?" "Out in his sand pile." "Why, I thought he ran away if he was left out of anybody's sight for a minute. I thought you didn't dare let him be by himself for—" "Oh, Stevie's all right," said Lester carelessly. "He's coming along like a house afire." He wheeled himself to the door, opened it, and rolled his chair out onto the porch. A blue-denimed little figure rose up from the other end and showed a tousled head, bright dark eyes, and a round dirty face with a calm expression. "I got my tunnel fixed," he announced. "Did you?" said Lester with interest. "That can business did work?" To Mattie he explained. "Stephen is fixing up a railway system, and the sand kept falling in on his tunnel. We finally thought of taking the bottom out of an old baking powder can. That leaves it open at both ends." "It works dandy," said Stephen. He now added of his own accord, with a casual look at Mrs. Farnham, "Hullo, Aunt Mattie." It was the first time Mrs. Farnham could remember that she had ever had a friendly greeting from Stephen. Eva's conscientious attempts to make him perform the minimum of decent salutations, to come and shake hands and say "How do you do?" usually ended in a storm of raging, stamping refusals. "Hello, Stephen," she answered, feeling quite touched by his friendly tone. He looked very quiet and good-natured, too. Well, of course, all children do grow out of their naughty ways, if you can only live till then. She had always said that Stephen would outgrow his, but she had never believed it. It was a good idea to have a sand pile for him. Children always like them. Of course it brought sand into the house, something terrible. Children never would wipe their feet. But now that any attempt at real housekeeping had been given up in poor Eva's house, a little more or less dirt didn't matter. She had, as a matter of fact, although she had denied it, noticed that the corners of the room were very dusty. And those preposterous papers on the floor, what a ridiculous idea. Oh, no more ridiculous than having a sand pile on the porch. Who ever heard of such a thing? "I should think you'd find it hard to keep the porch clean," she said to Lester. "We don't," he said bafflingly. "Why not have it out in the yard?" "Some of the playthings would get spoiled by the rain." He advanced this as conclusive. Stephen had squatted down again to his sand. She went cautiously towards the wide plank to see what he was doing, prepared to have him snarl out one of his hateful catchwords, "Go away," or the one he had acquired lately, the insolent, "Who's doing this anyhow?" But what she saw was so astonishing to her that before she could stop to think, she burst out in an impulsive exclamation of admiration. "Why, Stephen Knapp, did you do all that yourself?" Beyond the board lay a tiny fairy world of small, tree-lined, pebble-paved roads, moss-covered hills, small looking-glass lakes, white pasteboard farmhouses with green blinds, surrounded by neat white toothpick fences, broad meadows with red and white paper cows, and a tiny farm wagon with minute plumped-out sacks driving to the railroad. A large area of her own simple consciousness was still sunny with child-heartedness, and it was with the utmost sincerity of accent that she cried out, "Why, I'd love to play with that myself!" Stephen looked proudly up at her and lovingly down at his creation. "You can, if you want to." He conceded this privilege with lordly generosity. She got stiffly down on her middle-aged knees to be nearer this little world, and clasped her hands in ecstasy over the sweet little barn and the darling locomotive. Why, she remembered now that she herself had given that toy train to Stephen. The last time she had noticed it was when, unsurprised, she had seen Stephen kicking it down the stairs. Lucky it was made of steel. "It fits in just great," said Stephen, also remembering who had given it. "I never had any way to play with it before. See, it carries the corn from this farm to the city. I'm going to start in on the city tomorrow, over there in that corner, as soon as I get the track fixed. Mother's going to bring me some little houses from the 10-cent store. Mother brought me the little wagon and horses. She brings me something most every night. Those bags are filled with real cornmeal." "Oh, see the real grade crossing, with the little lookout for the engine sign," cried Mrs. Farnham rapturously. They had both entirely forgotten Lester. He smiled to himself and wheeled his chair back into the house. Mattie was a fat old darling, that's what she was. He went on darning the little stocking, and murmuring to himself, "She wars not with the mystery of time and distance, night and day, the bonds of our humanity. Her joy is like an instinct joy of kitten, bird, or summer fly. She dances, runs without an aim, she chatters in her ecstasy." When Mattie came in, not dancing at all, but walking rather rheumatically, as though her knees creaked, she closed the door behind her and said in an impressive way, "Lester Knapp, that is a very smart thing for Stephen to do. I don't believe you appreciate it. There's not one 5-year-old child in 100 with the headpiece to do it." He answered with an impressive manner of his own, "Appreciate it? I'm the fellow who does appreciate it. Stephen Knapp is a very remarkable child, I'd have you know, Mrs. Farnham. I bet you a nickel he will amount to more than anybody else in this whole town if only he gets the right chance." As she walked home, Mattie thought how funny it was to hear a man going on like a mother, standing up for the least promising of the children. But all the same, perhaps there was more to Stephen than just his cussedness. How cheerful Lester had seemed. It must be that his food had set better than usual today. End of section 14. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 15. Saturdays were great days for the Knapp family incorporated. They were together at home all day, and always with a great variety of schemes on hand. In the morning, Henry usually relapsed from his 11-year-old dignity back into younger days and played with Stephen, especially since the sandpile settlement had been started, and since they had a brood of chickens to care for. Old Mrs. Hennessy came to give the house its weekly thorough cellar-to-garret cleaning, which Lester had found was the best way to keep Evangeline from spending Sunday with a mop and broom. In the kitchen, Helen and her father, foregathering over the cookbook, struggled fervently with cookery more ambitious than that of the usual weekday. Helen loved these Saturday morning cooking bees, as she called them. She and Father had such a good time together. It was so funny, Father not knowing any more than she did about it all and having to study it out from the book. Lots of times even she, was able to give him pointers about things the cookbook didn't tell. For instance, at the very beginning, that historic first day long ago when they had first cooked together and timorously tried to have scrambled eggs for lunch, it had been Helen who conquered those bomb-like raw eggs. Lester had gingerly broken off the top of one and was picking the shell carefully away, when Helen said informingly, "That's not the way. Mother gives them a crack in the middle on the edge of the bowl and opens them that way." "How? Show me," said her father docilely, handing her another egg. Feeling very important, Helen took it masterfully, and holding it over the edge of the bowl, lifted her hand with an imitation of Mother's decisive gesture. But she did not bring it down. She shuddered, rolled her eyes at her father, and said miserably, "Suppose I hit it too hard and it all spurts out." Her father felt no impulse to cry out bitterly on her imbecile ineptitude. Rather, he sympathized with her panic. "Yes, raw eggs are the dickens," he said understandingly. Intimidated, they both looked at the smooth oval enigma. "You do it," said Helen, with her self-distrusting impulse to shift responsibility to someone else. Her father refused with horror to assume it. "Not on your life," he cried. "You were the one who's seen Mother do it." "Doesn't the cookbook say how to do it anywhere?" asked Helen, trying to fall back on someone else. "There's a chapter at the end that tells you how to take out ink stains and what to do for people who've got poisoned and all sorts of things. Maybe it'll say there." They laid down the egg to search, but found nothing in the 400 pages of this big book that told them how to break a raw egg. "Perhaps you could lay it down on a plate and cut it in two with a knife," suggested Lester. Even Helen knew better than this. She knew better than that when she was born, she thought, suppressing a pitying smile. "Gracious, no! You would get the shell all mixed up with the insides," she explained. They stared again at the egg. To Helen came the knowledge that responsibility must be assumed. "Somebody's got to," she said grimly. "I'll try again." She took the egg in her hand and resolutely struck it a small blow on the edge of the bowl. The shell cracked a little. "That sounds good," said Lester. "Give it another whack." She repeated the blow, and holding the egg up above her head till she could see the underside, reported that there was a perceptible crack and some wetness oozing out. But that was not enough. She must go on and see it through. How queer not to have somebody to tell her what to do and make her do it. "I'm going to try to pull it apart," she announced courageously, feeling like a heroine. She got the tips of her fingers into the tiny crack and pulled, shutting her eyes. Something happened. A gush of cold, sticky stuff over her fingers, a little glass-like tinkle of breaking eggshell in her hand, and there in the bowl were the contents of the egg, the golden yolk swimming roundly in the transparent white. "Hurrah! Good for you!" shouted her father admiringly. But Helen found in her heart a new conscience, which made her refuse to accept too easily won praise. "No, that's not right," she said, frowning at the crushed and dripping shell in her hand. "When Mother does it, the stuff comes out nice and clean, with each half of the shell like a little cup." She closed her eyes, summoned all her willpower, and thought back to the times when she had watched Mother cook. Mother held it so. Helen went through the pantomime. She brought it down with a little quick jerk so, and then— "Oh, goody, goody, I know," she cried, hopping up and down. "I know. She turns it over after she's cracked it, with the crack on the upside, and then she pries it open. Give me another egg." Well, it certainly was a far cry from those early fumbling days, wasn't it, to now, when both she and Father could crack and separate an egg with their eyes shut and one hand tied behind their backs, so to speak, when they thought nothing of turning out in a Saturday morning a batch of bread, 2 pies, and enough cookies to last them a week. They didn't even talk about their cooking much anymore, just decided what they were going to make and went ahead and made it, visiting together as they worked like a couple of magpies chattering. Father often told her poetry as she stepped to and fro. The kitchen seemed to her just chock full of poetry. Father had said so much there the walls seemed soaked with it. Sometimes in the evening, when she went in just before she went to bed to get a drink of water or to see that the bread sponge was all right, it seemed to her, especially if she were a little sleepy, that she could hear a murmur of poetry all around her, the way a shell murmurs when you put it to your ear. "Now all away to Tir Nan Og are many roads that run, keen as are the arrows of that silver sphere. Waken, lords and ladies gay, to the greenwood haste away. Since brass nor stone nor earth nor boundless sea, but sad mortality o'ersways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea?" It was not water that Helen Knapp drank out of the tin dipper hung over the sink. It was ambrosia. And Father told her stories, too, all kinds, lots of funny ones that set them into gales of laughter. And they talked about everything, about her writing, and what she was reading in school, and the last book she had got out of the library. And once in a great while Father would tell her something about when he went to the state university and what an exciting time he'd had, finding out how much he loved books and poetry. Helen had never heard Father speak of those years till now. He seemed to feel, the way she did, that it was easier to talk about things you cared awfully about when you were working together. Helen often wondered why this was, why she didn't feel so queer and shy when she was doing something with her hands, buttering a cake tin, or cutting animal-shaped cookies out of the dough that Father rolled so beautifully thin. She even found that she could talk to Father about things. By things, Helen meant all that she had always before kept to herself, what she had never supposed you could talk about to anybody. The little poems that sprang up in your head, what you felt when the spring days began to dapple the sidewalks with shadows from the baby leaves, what you felt when you woke up at night and heard the freight trains hooting and groaning to and fro in the yards. Helen loved living near the railroad. What you thought about growing up, what you thought about God, what kind of husband you would like to have when you were big, what kind of children you hoped you'd have. "I'd kind of like a little baby boy with curly yellow hair," she said thoughtfully one day, as she bent her head over the butter and sugar she was creaming together. "Henry was like that when he was little," her father said reminiscently. "It was nice. You were an awfully nice baby too, Helen. Of course, being the first, you made the biggest impression on me. You had ideas of your very own from the time you began to creep. You never would go on your hands and knees like other babies. You always went on your hands and feet, with your little behinder sticking up in the air like a ship's prow." Helen laughed over that. She loved to have her father tell all about when she had been a baby, and how much he had loved her, and how smart she had been, and sometimes how funny, as on the day when she had thought Mrs. Anderson had stayed long enough, and had toddled over to her, putting out a fat little hand, and saying firmly, "Bye-bye, Miss Anderson, bye-bye." Gracious, how long ago that seemed to Helen, and how grown up it made her feel, now that she was such a big girl, 13 years old, helping to do up the week's baking and all. She felt old and ripe and sure of herself as she listened to those baby stories and wrung out the dishcloths competently. She and Father had wrestled with the question of how to hold the dishcloths when you wrung them out, as they had wrestled with the method of breaking an egg, and had slowly worked it out together. She came to feel that talking to Father when they were alone together was almost like thinking aloud, only better because there was somebody to help you figure things out when you got yourself all balled up. Before this, Helen had spent a great deal of time trying to figure things out by herself, and getting so tangled that she didn't know where she had begun nor how to stop the wild whirl racing around in her head. But now, with Father to hang on to, she could unravel those twisted skeins of thought and wind them into balls where she could get at them. One day, as she washed the breakfast dishes for Father to wipe, she noticed how the daffodils Aunt Mattie had brought were reflected in a wet milk pan. It made her think a poem, which she said over in her head to make sure it was all right, and then repeated to Father. "The shining tin usefulness of the milk pan is glorified into beauty by the presence of a flower." Father listened, looked at the golden reflection in the pan, said appreciatively, "So it is," and added, "That's quite a pretty poem, especially the last phrase." Helen knew it was pretty. She had secretly a high opinion of her own talents. Why had she said it aloud, except to make Father think what a remarkable child she was? She washed the dishes thoughtfully, feeling a gnawing discomfort. It was horrid of her to have said that just to make Father admire her. It was showing off. She hated people who showed off. She decided, ascetically, to punish herself by owning up to her conceit. "I only told that poem to you because I thought it would make you think what a poetic child I am," she confessed contritely. "It wasn't really that I thought so much about the flower." She felt better, There now. Father would think what an honest, sincere child she was. Oh dear, that was showing off too, as bad as the first time. She said hastily, "And I only owned up because I thought it would make you think I'm honest and I didn't want to show off." This sort of tortuous winding was very familiar to Helen. She frequently got herself into it and never knew how to get out. It always frightened her a little, made her lose her head. She felt startled now. "Why, Father, do you suppose I only said that, too, to make you—" She lifted her dripping hands out of the dishwater and turned wide, frightened eyes on her father. "Oh, Father, there I go. Do you ever get going like that? One idea hitched to another and another and another, and you keep grabbing at them and can't get hold of one tight enough to hold it still." Lester laughed ruefully. "Do I? Nothing but. I often feel like a dog digging into a woodchuck hole, almost grabbing that woodchuck's tail and never quite getting there." "That's just it," said the little girl fervently. "I tell you, Helen," said Lester, "that's one of the reasons why it's a pretty good thing for anybody with your kind of mind, or mine, to go to college. If you try, you can find out in college how to get after those thoughts that chase their own tails like that." "You can," said Helen, astonished that other people knew about them. "I suppose you think," conjectured Lester, hanging up the potato masher, "that you're the only person bothered that way. But as a matter of fact, lots and lots of people have been from the beginning of time. You've heard about the Greek philosophers, haven't you? Well, that is really about all they were up to." There was a pause while Helen wiped off the top of the kitchen table. Then she remarked thoughtfully, "I believe I'd like to go to college." It was the first time she had ever thought of it. Oh no, it was not always recipes they talked about on Saturday mornings. And on Saturday nights, as he reached for some book to take to bed with him, Lester's hand not infrequently fell on an old, rubbed, shabby volume, which fell open at the passage, "The thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction, not indeed for that which is most worthy to be blessed, delight and liberty, the simple creed of childhood, whether busy or at rest, but for those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings, blank misgivings of a creature moving about in worlds not realized, high instincts before which our mortal nature did tremble like a guilty thing surprised. But for those first affections, those shadowy recollections, which, be they what they may, are yet the fountain light of all our day, and yet the master light of all our seeing, uphold us, cherish, and have power to make our noisy years seem moments in the being of eternal silence, truths that wake to perish never, which neither listlessness, nor mad endeavor, nor man, nor boy, nor all that is at enmity with joy, can utterly abolish or destroy." From here on, Lester always felt a great tide lift him high. Hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. It was to the shouts of those children, to the reverberation of those mighty waters, that the paralyzed accountant often slipped quietly from his narrow drudging life into the being of eternal silence. End of section 15. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 16. One of the most embittering elements of Lester's old life had been the absence of any leisure when he could really think, consider things consecutively enough to make any sort of sense out of them. He seemed to himself to live perpetually in the mental attitude of a man with a watch in his hand and a heavy valise in the other, running for a train which was already overdue. How much value would the judgment of such a man have? He had always thought he would like to be able to sit right down quietly to think out a thing or two. Now he certainly had all the sitting down quietly that anybody could want. Well, he liked it as much as he had thought he would, and more. He brought under his consideration one after another of the new elements of his new life, holding them firmly under the lens of his intelligence, focusing on them all his attention, and to his astonished relief saw them one by one yield to his analysis, give up their tortured, baffling aspect of mystery and tragedy, and lie open to his view, open to his hand, open to his forward-looking planning. He had never lived with his family before. He had never seen more of their lives than the inexplicable and tangled loose ends over which they all stumbled wretchedly. Now that for months he had had the opportunity for continuous observation, he perceived that there was nothing so darkly inexplicable after all, nothing that resisted a patient, resourceful attempt to follow up those loose ends and straighten out some of the knots. Even in the tragic tangle of Stephen's strange little nature, Lester felt he had begun to find his way. He had found out this much: Stephen had more vitality than all the rest of them put together, except Eva, of course. And when it did not find a free outlet, it strangled and poisoned him, made him temporarily insane, in the literal sense of the word, like a strong, masterful man shut up by an accident deep in a coal mine, who might fall insanely to work with his bare hands to claw away the obstructing masses of dead brute matter that kept him from the light of day. That was what Stephen made him think of. That was, so Lester divined, the meaning of the wild, fierce flame in Stephen's eyes, which had always so shocked and grieved them. They were of another breed, the kind who would sit down patiently and resignedly to die, not fight to the last minute with bleeding hands. All but Eva. Oh, poor darling Eva! How much better Lester understood his wife, after those few months of observing her in a life that suited her, than after 14 years of seeing her grimly and heroically enduring a life that did not. Was this Eva the same as the old one? This Eva who came in every evening, tired, physically tired, as he had never seen her, but appeased, satisfied, fulfilled, having poured out in work she loved the furious splendor of her vigor. His heart ached with remorse as he thought of the life to which he had condemned her. Why, like Stephen, she had been buried alive, in a shaft deep under the earth, and she had not even had Stephen's poor passionate outlet of misdirected fury. What she thought was her duty had held her bound fast in a death-like silence and passivity. He remembered the somber, taciturn, self-contained woman who had sat opposite him year after year at the supper table. Could that be the same Eva who now, evening after evening, made them all gay with her accounts of the humours of her profession, who could take off a fussy customer so to the life that even Stephen laughed, who could talk with such inspired animation of the variations of fashion that even he listened, deadly as was his hatred for fashion and all that it stood for? He had never even suspected that Eva had this jolly sense of humour. Could it be the same Eva who so briskly dealt the cards around every evening, and took up her hand with such interest? Those evenings of whist had been an inspiration of his. In answer to 2 questions that he had set himself, what could he invent that would keep Eva's mind off the housekeeping in the evenings? And what could he and Eva and the children do together, which they would all really and truly enjoy? What was some natural manner in which to make a civilized contact between the 2 generations and the widely differing temperaments? It was delightful to him to see how Eva enjoyed it, how she liked to win. Just think of her caring to win. How young in nature she remained. She made him feel like Methuselah. How cheerily and heartily she coached Henry along. How the children admired her skill and luck, and how she enjoyed their admiration. Heavens! How unhappy she must have been before, like a Titan forced to tend a miniature garden. forced to turn that great flood of inherited specialized ability of hers into the tiny shallow channels of the infinitely minute detail of child care, forced day after day, hour by hour, minute by minute, with no respite, into a life and death closeness of contact with the raw, unfinished personalities of the children, from which her own ripe maturity recoiled in ever-renewed impatience. Eva always hated anything unfinished, and nothing around her ever stayed unfinished very long. How she put through any job she undertook. She had sat up all one night to finish that sofa she had so wonderfully refurbished. But you couldn't put through the job of bringing up children. No amount of energy on your part, no, not if you sat up all night every night of your life, could hurry by a single instant the slow unfolding from within of a child's nature. Eva dropped out of Lester's mind whenever he thought of this, and he was all flooded with the sweet early morning light that shone from his daughter's childhood. He always felt like taking off his hat when he thought of Helen. Sometimes, when they were working together, and Helen was moved to lift the curtain shyly and let him look at her heart, he held his breath before the revelation of the strange, transparent whiteness of her thoughts. That was the vision before which the greatest of the poets had prostrated themselves. And yet the best that had been done by the greatest of them was only a faint shimmer from the distant shrine. He understood now how Blake, all his life long, had been shaken when he thought of children. Thousands of little boys and girls raising their innocent hands. Through all the leaping, furious, prophetic power of Blake, there ran, like a sun-flooded stream, this passion of loving reverence for little boys and girls. And under his quaintly formal rhymed words, how Wordsworth's deep heart had melted into the same beatitude, that almost I received her heart into my own. Helen's father knew now how literally a man could feel that about a little girl. And yet this did not mean that he thought Helen was perfect. No, poor child, with her too flexible mind, her too sensitive nerves, her lack of power and courage, Helen needed all the help she could get if she were not to be totally undone by life. He knew a thing or two about how ruthless life is to anyone who lacks power and courage. Helen must learn how to stand up to things, and not lie down and give up. He would find ways to teach her. Yes, he knew wincingly what sarcastic people would ask. How could he teach her what he had never learned himself? But the fact that he had never learned himself was the very reason for his understanding the dire need for it. Perhaps it might come from athletics. She must learn to play on a team, how to take rough, careless, good-natured knocks and return them and pass on her way. As soon as he could get about on crutches, somehow, perhaps he would go to that physical training teacher at school and have a talk about Helen. Perhaps he could get up an outdoor basketball team of the children here on the street. He had plans, all sorts of plans. Above all, Helen must go to college. It wasn't so much going to college. He had no illusions about it. For a strong personality like Stephen's, it might very well not be worthwhile. But for a bookish, sensitive, complicated nature like Helen's, the more her intelligence was shaped and pointed and sharpened and straightened out, the better. She would need it all to cope with herself. She was not one for whom action, any action, provided it were violent enough, would suffice. Would it for Henry? How about Henry, anyhow? How everybody always left Henry out. That was because there wasn't anything unusual about that nice little boy. He was a nice little boy, and if he grew to his full stature, he would be a nice man, a good citizen, a good husband. No leader of men, but a faithful common soldier, perhaps a sergeant in the great army of humanity. But he had a right to his own life, didn't he, even if he weren't unusual? You didn't want everybody to be unusual. There were moods in which Lester Knapp took the greatest comfort in Henry's being just like anybody else. So much the better for him, for everybody. There would never be tragedy in his life. No thwarted, futile struggling against an organization of things that did not fit him. At times, too, there was something poignant to Lester about Henry's patient, unrebellious attitude. He never fought to get what he wanted. He stood back, took what others left, and with a touching, unconscious resignation made the best of it. All the more reason for Henry's father to stand up for him, to think of how to get him more of what he wanted. He began to plan for Henry now. What would Henry naturally want? Just what any little boy wanted. The recipe was well known. Playmates of his own age, a gang. Some kind of shack in the woods to play pirate. Games, lots and lots of games. A pet of his own. Perhaps a job at which he could earn real money of his own to spend on a baseball mitt or a bicycle. Why, Henry didn't have a single one of those things, not one, and he was 11 years old. That afternoon, when the children came home, he waited till they had unpacked their minds of their school news, and then asked casually, "Say, Henry, wouldn't you like to have a puppy to bring up? I used to think the world of my dog when I was your age." A quick look passed between Henry and Helen, a look rather wild with the unexpectedness of their father's question. Henry flushed very red and looked down dumbly at his piece of bread and butter. Helen spoke for him placatingly. "You see, Father, Mother never wanted Henry to... But, well, Henry has a puppy, sort of." Seeing nothing but expectant interest in her father's face, she went on. "Old Mrs. Hennessy's Laura had puppies about 6 weeks ago, and Mrs. Hennessy said Henry could have one. Henry always did want one so. And Henry," her accent was increasingly apologetic, "Henry sort of did pick out one for his. It's white with black spots, awfully cunning. And noon-times Henry runs over from school to the Hennessy's to play with it. Mrs. Hennessy and Laura are weaning the puppies now. He's beginning to lap milk. Oh, Father, haven't they got the darlingest little red tongues? Henry's named him Rex. Mrs. Hennessy said Henry could keep it at her house, because Mother..." A new possibility opened before her like the horizon lifting. "Oh, Father, do you suppose she would let Henry have it, now?" That "now" referred to the change in Mother which they had all noticed, but never mentioned, even in so distant a manner as this now. It had slipped out in Helen's excitement. Lester took no notice of it. "Do you suppose she would?" asked Henry, in an agitated voice. He was now quite pale. Heavens, what a sensitive little chap he is, thought Lester. How worked up he does get over little things. Aloud he said, "Well, she might. Let's ask her this evening." So they did. She came in rather late and pretty tired. Her feet ached a good deal by night-time, now it was warm weather, and Helen usually had a good hot bath waiting for her when she came. Mother kissed her and said what a comfort she was before shutting the door of the bathroom. Helen jumped happily downstairs 2 steps at a time to help Father get the supper on. It was steaming on the table when Mother came down, in the pretty, loose, red silk house dress which she had bought at the store at such a bargain, for nothing, as she said. She looked relaxed and quiet, and said she was starved, and so glad they had veal cutlets. It was a joy to watch Mother eat after her day's work. They never washed the dishes in the evenings now, because Mother getting her own breakfast downtown, it was no matter how the kitchen looked in the morning. Henry and Helen piled them on the new wheeled tray which Mr. Willing had so kindly sent them, pushed that into the kitchen, and put them to soak, while Father and Mother got Stevie to bed and lighted the little bedside candle at which Stephen loved to stare himself to sleep. Then they hurried into the living room for the evening rubber of whist. Mother's luck was especially good that evening, a fact in which they all took an innocent satisfaction. Mother liked it when her luck was good. Then, all of a sudden, the opening was there, and Father was taking advantage of it in a masterful way. Mother had said something about the 2 little Willing girls who had been down to the store that day with their dog, and Father put in at once, "By the way, Eva, old Mrs. Hennessy wants to give Henry one of a litter of puppies her dog has. What would you say? It's springtime, so it could be out of doors mostly." How they admired him for being able to speak so casually. "By the way, Eva," he was wonderful. Under the table, Helen's hand squeezed Henry's hand. Mrs. Knapp still had before her eyes the picture of those 2 fashionably dressed children and their fashionably accoutred dog with his studded collar and harness and the bright tan braided leather of his leash. She had never thought of dogs in terms of smartness before. "He'd make a lot of trouble for you," she said, looking over at her husband. "Oh, I'd manage all right. I like dogs," said Lester carelessly. "You'd have to promise Henry to keep him out of this room. I don't want dog hairs all over everything." It was the old formula, but not pronounced with the old conviction. After all, she would not be there to see. She was often surprised that she worried so little about the looks of the house nowadays. "Oh, I'd never let him in here," promised Henry in a strangled voice. "Well," said his mother. She looked down at the cards in her hand. There was a silence. "Who took that last trick?" she asked. "You did," said her husband, although he had. They began to play again. It had been as easy as that. Lester had quite forgotten about the dog that evening as he pottered around the kitchen over some last tasks. He heard the bathroom door shut and knew that Eva had gone in for her evening toilette. At once afterwards his ear caught the stealthy sound of bare feet on the stairway. He turned his head towards the door and saw Henry come hurrying in on tiptoe. He opened his lips to make some joking inquiry about whatever it could be that kept Henry up so late, but the expression on the child's face silenced him. Good heavens, had he cared so much as that about owning a dog? Henry came up to him without a word, and leaning over the wheel of the invalid chair, put his arms around his father's neck, leaning his cheek against his father's shoulder. "Oh, Father," he said in a whisper, with a long tremulous breath. He tightened his arms closer and closer, as though he could never stop. Lester patted the little boy's back silently. He was thinking, "I hope he'll come like this to tell me when he's in love and has been accepted. I don't believe he'll be any more stirred up." The child's body quivered against his breast. After a time, Lester said quietly, "Better get to bed, old man. You'll take cold with your bare feet." Docilely and silently, Henry went back upstairs to bed. End of section 16. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 17. Old Mrs. Anderson, having borne 7 children and raised 3 to maturity, not to speak of having made a business of guiding Mrs. Knapp by neighborly advice through the raising of her 3, knew what was brewing with Stephen the moment she stepped into the kitchen. She had been expecting Stephen to have one of his awful tantrums again any day. The only reason he hadn't so far was because poor crippled Mr. Knapp was so weak and so indifferent to what the children did that Stephen was allowed to have his own way about everything. But foolish indulgence wore out after a while and only made things worse in the end. All the regulation signs of an advancing storm were there. She noted them with a kindling eye. Stephen's face was clouded. He gave her a black look and did not answer her "How do, Stevie dear?" And as she took a chair, he flung down his top with all his might. A moment later, as he lounged about the kitchen with that insolent swagger of his that always made her blood boil, he gave a savage kick at his blocks. Now was the time to give Mr. Knapp some good advice that would save him trouble in the end. She never could stand hunchbacks and cripples, and had not liked Mr. Knapp very well even before he was so dreadfully paralyzed. But she felt it her duty to help out in that stricken household. "You'll have trouble with that child today, Mr. Knapp," she said wisely. "He's spoiling for a spanking. Anybody with experience can see that by looking at him." My, what a relief 'twill be when he's out of the house and goes to school with the others." It had been her habit thus to diagnose Stephen to his mother, and as for the remark about the relief it would be to have Stephen go to school, it was threadbare from repetition. She scarcely knew she had said it, so familiar was it. It astonished her to have Mr. Knapp look at her as though she had said something which shocked him. She was nettled at his look, and replied to it resentfully by a statement of her oft-repeated philosophy of life. "The only way to manage children, Mr. Knapp, is never to let them get ahead of you. If you watch for the first signs of naughtiness and cut it short," her gesture indicated how it was to be cut short, "it doesn't go any further." To illustrate her point, she now addressed Stephen's listening, stubborn back in a reproving tone of virtue. "Stephen, you mustn't kick your blocks like that. It's naughty to." Stephen instantly kicked them harder than ever, and continued to present a provocatively rebellious back to the visitor. Mrs. Anderson turned to his father with the gratified look traditionally ascribed to the Teutonic warlords when they forced Serbia into a corner. She tapped the fingers of one hand rapidly in the palm of the other, and waited for the father of the criminal to take action. He continued to draw his needle in and out of the stocking he was darning. His face looked like Stephen's back. What a disagreeable man Mr. Knapp was. She was not surprised that he had been so disliked by all the sensible people at the store. And how ridiculous for a man to be darning a stocking. He might at least look ashamed of it. Mrs. Anderson disliked him so much at this moment that she felt herself trembling and burning. "Well, Mr. Knapp, you're not going to just pass over willful disobedience like that, I hope," she said, her voice shaking with anger as much at Stephen's father as at Stephen. "I didn't tell Stephen not to kick his blocks," he said dryly. Her sense of extravagant rightness in the face of insane wrongness flamed over her so hotly that she could scarcely speak. "Well, but, oh, I understand, she finally brought out bitterly. "I understand. You think it is all right and perfectly proper for Stephen to kick things around as much as he pleases." Mr. Knapp stooped to look into the oven, where a rice pudding was cooking. How ridiculous for a man to be cooking a rice pudding. "I'm sure I don't know why you think you understand anything about it, because I have not told you what my opinion on the subject is," he said over his shoulder. Stephen's back became more acutely listening. He did not understand the big words, and he could not make out his father's tone, except that, unlike mother, he did not get mad at Stephen and begin to pick on him whenever Mrs. Anderson had been there a little while. Mrs. Anderson did not make out Mr. Knapp's tone very well herself, except that it was all part of his intense disagreeableness. A weak, poor creature Lester Knapp was, a perfect failure at everything, and without even the poor virtue of knowing it. Besotted in self-conceit into the bargain, though she had never suspected that before. Poor Mrs. Knapp! And those poor children! Her mother's heart ached for them left in such hands. Mr. Knapp went on drawing his thread to and fro silently. Little by little, out of the air, Mrs. Anderson drew the information that she had been insulted, though she had not perceived exactly when. She felt rasped to the bone. With dignity she drew her cape up around her shoulders and prepared to go. "Take the advice of an old woman who was bringing up children before you were born," she said solemnly, her voice shaking with the depth of her feeling. "You'll find out when it's too late that they must be made to mind. Everything depends on that." Mrs. Knapp, their poor mother, understood that perfectly. "Good afternoon," said Mr. Knapp, very distinctly. The door closed behind her ungently enough, and with its slam Lester Knapp felt himself transported by an invigorating wave of anger such as he had rarely felt in his life. Simple, hot, vivifying rage, as good as a drink of whiskey. It made him feel twice as alive as usual. Strange thing, the human mind, he thought rapidly. When I ran into Mrs. Andersonism in business, it only made me sick, sort of hamstrung me with disgust. Anything they'd put their filthy hands on, I'd rather let them have than touch them enough to fight them. But when it threatened Stephen, God, I love to fight it. I'd enjoy strangling that old harpy with my 2 hands. She thinks she can bully me by threatening my vanity, does she? She thinks she can get her damned old hands on my little boy, does she? I should say it was enough to have killed 4 of her own. He looked over at Stephen's brooding back and set his stirred and sharpened wits to the problem of switching Stephen off from the track that was taking him towards one of his explosions. He had discovered that Stephen's salvation at such times was something hard to do, something Stephen could struggle with but not quarrel with. He thought fast, almost excitedly. Would he think of something first, or would Stephen blow up first? Stephen turned away from the pile of toys and began to wander about the kitchen, casting a somber eye on the 2 familiar things. "Alexander, Alexander, what new world can I get for you?" asked his father, unleashing his inventiveness and sending it leaping forward on the trail. In a moment, "Say, Stephen, how would you like to beat up a pretend egg?" he asked. Stephen glowered at him suspiciously, but with a spark of unwilling curiosity in his dark eye. "Like this," said his father. He wheeled himself to the shelf, took down a tin basin, filled it with warm water, put a bit of soap into it, and began to whip it up to a froth with the egg beater. Stephen's face lightened. Ever since he could remember, he had seen his mother playing with that fascinating toy. Ever since he could remember, he had put his hand out for it. Ever since he could remember, his mother had said, "No, no, you'd only make a mess," and had hung it up out of his reach. He had gone too far towards a nervous explosion to be able to say, "Oh, goody," or "Give it to me," but he held out his hand silently. His father took no notice of his sullen expression, and did not offer to show him how it worked. Stephen set the egg beater in the water, and with perfect confidence began to try to turn the handle. He always had perfect confidence that he could do anything he tried. At once the egg beater slipped sideways and fell to the floor. Stephen frowned, picked it up, and held it tighter with his left hand. But he found that when he put his attention on his left hand to make it hold tight, his right hand refused to make the round and round motion he so much admired. He had never before tried to do 2 different things with his 2 hands. He took his attention off his left hand and told his right hand to make the circular motion. Instantly the whole thing began to slip. As instantly he flashed his mind back on his left hand and caught the beater before it fell, but at once his right hand, left to itself, stopped turning. For him, it's just like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach, reflected Lester. Stephen was disconcerted by the unexpected difficulty of this undertaking. He stood still a moment in the mental attitude of a man who has caught a runaway pig by the ear and a hind leg and does not dare let go. He breathed hard and frowned at this perverse creature of steel in his hand. His father felt as the spectators at a prize fight feel when the second round begins. He prayed violently that nothing might interrupt the rest of the bout. Especially did he pray that old Anderson imbecile might not come in. If she did, he would just throw the stove lid at her head. What was he for, if not to protect Stephen from marauding beasts of prey? He himself did not make a motion, for fear of distracting Stephen's attention. The little boy went at it again, but with none of his first jaunty cocksureness. Cautiously, slowly, turning the handle a little at a time. He made no progress whatever. The combination of the 2 dissimilar motions was too much for him. If someone had held the egg beater still, he could have turned the handle, he knew that. But he would never ask anyone to do it. He would do it himself. Himself. He tried again and again without the slightest success, and began to put on that black savage look he had for things that displeased him. His father followed with sympathy as he toiled forward into the unmapped jungle of his own mind. How he stuck at it, the little tyke! And how touching was his look of outraged indignation at his own unruly right hand. His father said to himself, half laughing, half wistful, "Poor old man, we've all been there. That painful moment when we first realize that our right hands are finite and erring." He shook with silent mirth over the sudden, hot-tempered storm which followed in a tropical gust, when Stephen stamped his feet, ground his teeth, and turning red and purple with rage, tried by main strength to master the utensil. Lester turned his eyes discreetly down upon his darning, when Stephen, with a loud "Gall-darned old thing!" threw the egg-beater across the kitchen. He felt Stephen suddenly remember that his father was there, and glance apprehensively up at him. He chose that moment to stoop again to the oven door, and gaze fixedly in at the bland face of the rice pudding. But he did not see it. He saw Stephen's fiery little nature, at grips with itself, and inaudibly he was cheering him on. "Go to it, Stevie. Get your teeth into it. Eat it up." He was painfully, almost alarmingly interested in the outcome. Would Stephen conquer, or would he give up? Was there real stuff behind that grim stubbornness which had given them all such tragic trouble, or was it just hatefulness, as the Mrs. Anderson majority of the world thought it? He held a needle up to the light and threaded it elaborately, but he was really looking at Stephen, standing with his stout legs wide apart, glowering at the prostrate but victorious egg-beater. In spite of his sympathetic sense of the seriousness of this moment, Lester's diaphragm fluttered with repressed laughter. Cosmic Stephen in his pink gingham rompers. He took another stocking and ran his hand down the leg. Stephen sauntered over towards the beater, casually. He glanced back to see if he need fear any prying surveillance of his private affairs, but his father's gaze was now concentrated on the hole in the stocking. Carelessly, as though it were an action performed almost absent-mindedly, Stephen stooped, picked up the beater, and stood holding it, trying experiments with various ways of managing that maddening double action. His clumsiness, his muscular inexpertness with an unfamiliar motion, astounded his father. How far back children had to begin! Why, they did not know how to do anything, not till they had learned. This did not seem to him the trite platitude it would have been if somebody else had said it to him. It cast a new light into innumerable corners of their relations with Stephen, which had been dark and pestilential. They hadn't begun to be patient enough, to go slow enough. Stephen was to the egg-beater, to all of life, as he himself would be if put suddenly in charge of a complicated modern locomotive. No, Stephen was not. Painlessly, with the hard-won magnanimity of a man who has touched bottom and expects nothing out of life for himself, not even his own admiration, Lester recognized in Stephen's frowning, intent look on his problem a power, a heat, a will to conquer, which he had never had. He had never cared enough about either locomotives or egg-beaters to put his mind on them like that. Stephen got that power from his mother. From his other world of impersonality, Stephen's father saw it and thrilled in admiration, as over a ringing line in a fine poem. If only Stephen could be steered in life so that that power would be a bright sword in his hand and not a poison in his heart. The clock ticked gravely in the silence which followed. For Lester, the pause was full of grave, forward-looking thoughts about Stephen. Presently the little boy came back purposefully to the basin of water. He put the beater in, and once more tried to turn the handle. The perverse thing did all that perversity could imagine, slipped sideways, stuck, started too suddenly, twice fell to the floor clattering. Each time Stephen picked it up patiently and went back to work. Lester ached with fatigue at the sight of his perseverance. Heavens, nothing was worth such an effort as that. Why, with such earnest pains, dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke. But Stephen did not flinch. He felt he almost had it. Once he turned the wheel 3/4 of the way around. His heart leaped up. But after this it balked continuously. Stephen fetched a long, quavering sigh of discouragement and fatigue, but he did not stop trying. He could not have stopped. Something more potent than fatigue held him there. The tough fibers of his passionate will were tangled about his effort. He could not stop till he dropped. He was very near dropping. He scarcely knew what he was doing. His attention was so tired. But his hands, his brave, strong little hands, kept on working. His back and legs ached. His shoulders bowed themselves, but he did not stop. "Under the bludgeonings of chance," murmured Lester to himself. And then, all at once, it was as though Stephen had turned a corner. Something rearranged itself inside his head. Instead of toiling uphill, he felt himself begin to glide down easily. Why, he could do it. That rebellious right hand of his was suddenly tamed. Whirr went the steel spokes, flashing in the white suds. They sang like music in Stephen's ears. Whirr! He could hardly believe it. Once in a while it stuck or jerked. But he had only to take thought. Stephen could feel the thinking place in his head draw together hard, and command his hand to turn regularly. How it hated to, that old hand, and how Stephen loved the feeling of bossing it around. He turned and turned. The foamy suds frothed higher and higher. Whirr! The kitchen was full of the sound. Stephen threw back his head and, laughing proudly, looked up at his father. His face was ruddy and glowing with the effort, with his triumph. All his fatigue was gone. Whirr! His father drew a long breath. He felt like clapping his hands and shouting hurrah. It had been nip and tuck there for a while. Talk about the caveman who had invented the bow and arrow. If Stephen had been a caveman, he would have invented the telephone. What a stirring spectacle it had been. He felt as though he had been reading some Emerson, only it was lots better than any Emerson. "Well, sir," he exclaimed to the child, "I certainly will hate to have you begin going to school." The rice pudding was done. He took it out and put some coal on the fire and glanced at the clock. Well, it was almost time to expect the other children in from school. How the afternoon had flown. It was hard to put your mind on anything but the absorbing spectacle of Stephen's advance into life. He must get out the milk and cookies with which he welcomed the others in. They always burst in as soon as possible after 4. Sometimes Lester wondered what they had done before, in the old days, in that interval between 4 and 6, when he usually found them waiting for him at the door of the store. Evangeline used to say that they were playing round with their schoolmates. He had not noticed that Stephen had stopped turning the egg beater and was now looking up hard into his face, until the little voice asked, "What will you hate to have me go into school for?" Lester had to think for a moment before he could remember what he had said. Then, "Great Scott, Stevie, why wouldn't I? I'll miss you. What do you think? I'll be lonesome without my funny, nice little boy to keep me company." He wondered what made Stephen ask such a question. The child usually was quick enough to catch your meaning. He wheeled himself into the pantry, and did not see that Stephen, after standing for a moment, turned away and went quietly out of the room. When he came back and found him gone, Lester thought that probably he had gone upstairs to look for another toy. Stephen felt very queer inside, sort of shaky and trembly. He had never felt like that before. And the queerness went all over him, so that he couldn't be sure he wasn't making up a queer face that Father would ask him about. The first thing to do was to get away where nobody would see him. He turned away, trying to pretend to walk carelessly, and went into the empty dining room. But it didn't stop. He could feel it, making him tremble and shake inside. And yet he didn't feel sick. Oh, no. It was a strange, good feeling that was almost too much for him. It was too big for him. He was too little to hold it. It seemed to overflow him so that he could scarcely breathe, in a bright, warm, shining flood. And Stephen was such a little boy, he had never felt anything like it before. It frightened him, and yet he loved it. He must get off somewhere by himself, where he would be safe and alone, with this new, strange, bright, drowning feeling. Under the stairs, always his refuge, he crept in on his hands and knees, not noticing the dust which flew up in his face as he crept. Those corners were not clean as they had been when Mother kept the house, but Stephen thought of nothing but that now the quivering was all over him, even his face, the way it was when he was going to cry. He and his new feeling crept farther and farther in, as far as he could go. He sat down then, cross-legged, his face turned towards the safe, blind wall. He was safe. He was all alone. It was dark. He said to himself, so low that there was no sound, "Father will miss me when I go to school." And then, lower still, "Father likes to have me around." And suddenly Stephen's eyes overflowed, and his cheeks were wet, and hot drops fell down on his dusty hands. But he was not crying. He knew that. It hurt to cry, and this did not hurt. It helped. The water ran quietly out of his eyes and poured down his cheeks. It was as though something that had ached inside him so long that he had almost forgotten about it were melting and running away. He could feel it hurting less and less as the tears fell on his hands. It was as though he were being emptied of that ache. The tears fell more and more slowly and stopped. And now nothing hurt Stephen at all. There was no ache anywhere. Not even the old one, so old he had almost forgotten about it. Stephen felt weak and empty without it, and leaned his head faintly against the dusty dark wall. He sat there a long time, it seemed to him, till little by little he felt the weakness going out of his legs and the emptiness out of his body. He must go back to Father now, or Father would wonder where he was. But Father would think he had been crying, and would ask him why. How could Father tell the difference if he saw the wet on his cheeks? Stephen would have died rather than try to tell anyone what had been happening to him. He did not know at all what had been happening to him. He would rub the wet off his cheeks with his hands. Yes, that would do. Then Father would never know. He scrubbed vigorously at his eyes and his cheeks with his fists, and when he felt that there was no dampness left, he backed out on his hands and knees into the dining room again. Was it the same room it had been when he crept in? It didn't seem possible. It looked so different. And Stephen felt so different. Like another Stephen altogether. So light, so washed, so clear. He didn't seem to weigh anything at all, but to float through the air as he walked. Nothing looked to Stephen as it had. The walls and furniture had a sprightly, cheerful expression. He waved his hand to them as he floated out to the kitchen. Lester had been busy at first getting the 4 o'clock lunch ready for the children. He had taken down from the pantry shelf a paper bag of cookies. Yes, the boughten kind. They happened to be out of homemade ones. He ought to have been making some, instead of hanging fascinated over Stephen's hand-to-hand battle with the universe. But it was, glory be, no longer such a tragic matter, the sort of food Henry had. It certainly was a special provision of Providence that Henry and Helen were so much stronger than they had been, that just when they fell into his inexpert hands, they had begun to outgrow their delicate health. However could he have managed the care of them if they had been sick so often as when poor Eva had been struggling with the care of them? Wasn't it all a piece of her bad luck to have had them during that trying period, and turn them over to him just as her wonderful cooking and nursing had pulled them through? What a splendid nurse she was! He poured out a glass of milk apiece for the children, and looked impatiently at the clock. He loved the moment of their noisy arrival, loved the clatter of their feet on the porch, the bang of the door thrown open. Why were they late today? Oh yes, he remembered. They were due at a rehearsal of the school play, Helen's play, the one they had worked out together. What fun it was to have her bring him her little experiments in writing. He began to think that perhaps she might have a little real talent. Of course, most of what she set down was merely a copy of what she had read, but every once in a while there was a nugget, something she had really seen or felt. This, for instance, which he had found scrawled across the flyleaf of her arithmetic. Poor Helen and her hated arithmetic. The measured beats of the old clock bring peace to my heart and quiet to my mind. That was the real thing, a genuine expression of her own personality. How different from the personality of her mother, to whom the ticking of a clock could scarcely be anything but a trumpet call to action. Different from her father's personality, too. The clock always said to him, "But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near." Ah, what a second-rater he was! How he always thought of everything in terms of what somebody else had said. In earlier days, when he was a boy, and still thought he might perhaps amount to something, this had been an affliction to him, a secret shame. But now he did not grieve over it. Since he had died and come back to this other life, he took everything, and himself too, more simply, with little concern for the presentability of the role he was to play. If, honestly, that was the sort of nature he had, why rebel against it? The only people who got anywhere by rebelling were rebels to begin with, and he was not. Why wasn't it enough, anyhow, to love the beauties other men had created? He heard Stephen come back into the kitchen. He had been gone quite a while after that toy. "Father," said Stephen softly behind him. Lester started at the color of the little voice. There was something queer about it. Cautiously, with his ever-present dread of intruding, he glanced at Stephen, not curiously, but with a casual air. The little boy came up to his chair and stood there looking up at him with a strange expression of shining quiet in his eyes. He had evidently been crying hard, for his cheeks were covered with the smeary marks of black where he had wiped off the tears with dirty hands. But what on earth could he have been crying about? There had not been a sound. And he did not look like a child who has been crying. He was smiling now. He looked like a little golden seraph hovering around the golden gates. "Father," said Stephen, in a small, clear voice. He hesitated, evidently trying to think of something to say, his shining eyes fixed on his father's. Finally he brought out, "Wouldn't you like me to bring you a drink of water?" His smile as he said this was dazzling, his voice sweet with loving kindness. "Why, yes, Stevie," said his father, over a lump in his throat. "I do believe I'm thirsty without realizing it." Stephen pushed a chair before him to the sink, climbed up on it, took down the dipper and held it under the faucet. The bright water gushed out, spattering over him, over the floor. He caught half the dipper full, turned off the faucet, and carried the dipper awkwardly back to his father, who took a long drink, appreciatively. "Thank you, old man," he said, as he handed it back. Stephen set it back on the table and returned to hover near his father, smiling up at him speechlessly. Lester felt the room filled with the flutter of airy, unseen wings, and ached with his helpless wonder at them. What could have happened? He held his breath for fear of saying the wrong thing in his clumsy ignorance. All he dared do was smile silently back at Stephen. "Father," said Stephen again, although he evidently had nothing to add to the word. "Father." He could think of nothing else to say to express this mysteriously born fullness in his heart. "Yes, Stevie," said his father, his own heart very full. "Father, would it hurt your sick legs very much if I sat in your lap for a while?" Lester reached out hungrily and pulled the child up into his arms. "There's just one good thing that can be said about my sick legs, Stephen," he said, trying to be whimsical. "They positively cannot be hurt any more." Stephen laughed a little, nestled, turned himself, and then, with a long sigh, as though he were very, very tired, with a sudden relaxation of all his warm little body, was asleep, his round dark head falling back limply on his father's shoulder. Lester was almost frightened. Had the child fainted? Was he sick? But the expression on Stephen's face was of complete calm. It looked like a smooth, closed bud, secret and serene, close wrapped, all the personality at rest, nothing left but the tender mask of flesh. Lester stirred involuntarily a hair's breadth. Stephen felt the movement, and his eyes flew open wide for an instant. At first they were shallow and meaningless in a mere physical opening. Then, before sleep took him wholly, he recognized his father, and all that made the little boy Stephen shone out of his eyes like a candle leaping up brightly before it goes out. That look was for Lester. Without stirring, in the exquisite smile of his eyes, his lips, all his transfigured little face, Stephen gave himself lovingly to his father. Long after the burning little spirit had gone elsewhere, leaving the inert, deep-breathing, warm, small body on the paralyzed knees, his father sat there, his lips quivering. Presently he said to himself, "And I am the man who 3 months ago was so eager to get out of life." End of section 17. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 18. When Evangeline read the little note asking her to step into Mr. Willing's office, she thought, of course, that the new things from Hessenheimer's had come, and that Mr. Willing would ask her if she could come back that evening to help unpack and place them. But it was Mrs. Willing's voice which called "Come in" to her knock, and the moment she opened the door she knew by the expression on Mr. Willing's face that something important was on the way. Mr. Willing waited till she and his wife had gone through the necessary greetings, and then brought it out flatly. "Mrs. Knapp, Miss Flynn has just told us that because of certain changes in her family affairs, she will be leaving us next month." He went on talking after this, but Evangeline did not need to hear him. She knew everything that he would say before he said it, all except the salary, and that was certainly more than Miss Flynn had ever had, and to begin with. There was only one idea in her head. How soon could she fly to a telephone to tell Lester the good news? She could never wait till she went home that evening. She loved Lester for her certainty that it would make him as happy as she was, that he would not feel jealous or hateful. How good Lester was! She saw on the faces of the two people opposite her a reflection of what must be on her own. They understood what this moment was to her, and to them, too. She felt in their voices, as they talked to her, a new relationship towards her, a new respect. They needed her as she needed them. She was important to them and to their splendid work. It was wonderful to be really useful in a big thing. "Yes, indeed, Mrs. Willing," she assented with all her heart, as the younger woman said, "We feel that you can understand our position. It's not just a store to us, you see. It's our life work." This seemed a little flamboyant and feminine to Mr. Willing, who said correctively, "We think it a rather remarkable opportunity, all things considered, for giving good store service. With the support the store would naturally get from the town and the farming region around us, we expect," he coughed, "we hope, to double the business before so many years." "Oh, more than that," cried his wife. "Of course this is confidential, Mrs. Knapp. We wouldn't want it to go any further. But since we think of you as in on the ground floor with us, if with Mr. Willing's poor old uncle's rusty machinery the store actually paid expenses, There's simply no telling what can be done with a modern organization such as my husband has worked out in his mind. Better wages, lower prices, and what merchandise? My idea of good merchandise, Mrs. Knapp, said Mr. Willing seriously, is that it shall be a liberal education in taste. Mrs. Willing put in spiritedly, "Give us 10 years' time and see if the Saturday evening crowds don't look different in this town. The clothes they wear now must give them an inferiority complex right down to the marrow of their bones." "Give us 10 years' time," said Mr. Willing, laughing, "and see if there's a single golden oak Morris-chaired best room left in town." Evangeline felt dazzled by all that was happening. Her promotion, sitting here in such an intimate way with the proprietors of the business, having them talk in this wonderful way of their wonderful conception of what the business really was. It was her conception, too. Every word found an echo in her heart, although she had not had the education to express it brilliantly as they did. But she was uneasy at being away from her post so long. What would Miss Flynn think? The exquisite surprise it was to realize that it no longer made any difference what Miss Flynn thought. She felt an inch taller. Mr. Willing said now, "I've been wanting to have a talk with you about things in general, and now's as good a time as any. We want you to understand the situation in a comprehensive way, in a large way. There are certain elements in the retail dry goods business which give rise to considerable concern on the part of—" "Off on polysyllables," thought his wife. She cut in briskly, with the effect of scissors snipping in two a slowly unwinding tape. "It's the mail-order houses and the 10-cent stores that we're afraid of. It's frightful how they steal the business of country people away from where it belongs. The first thing that has to be done is to give them our dust, and it can be done by making the store known for such good personal service and such real attention to customers' needs that they'll enjoy coming to the store. And once they're inside the doors—" After all, how even the best of women see things in a little narrow concrete way, thought Mr. Willing. Nothing big and constructive in their minds. Aloud he said with simplicity and dignity, "I was brought up on a farm myself, Mrs. Knapp, and a very poor farm, and I have a very special feeling about our country customers. I know how few occasions there are in farm life for civilized mingling with our fellow men, how little brightness and color there is in country life. It is my ambition to make every trip to our store as educative as an afternoon tea party for the women folk on a farm, and I want every purchase at our counters to help every fine big farm boy to shuck off his awkward countrified ways that put him at such a disadvantage beside any measly little cocksure tenement house rat." Experiences of his own past burned in his voice. "We're counting on you, Mrs. Knapp, to train your girls to have just the right manner with the country customers. You know, cordial but respectful, friendly but no soft soap business." "I know just what you mean," Evangeline burst out suddenly, with such an earnest conviction that they stopped talking for an instant to enjoy her oneness with them. Yes, she would do, she would do. "My ideal," said Jerome, "is service. What I want the store to be is a little piece of the modern world at its best, set down within reach of all this fine American population around us. I want to select for them the right things, the things they never could select for themselves for lack of training. With modern methods, such as my wife and I are familiar with, a quicker turnover, with better salespeople, we can raise, not wages, but commissions, to keep efficiency up to the notch. And we can lower prices and sell goods that will put our people on a level with big city people. For I have long felt, Mrs. Knapp, that the alarming American exodus to the cities comes from a nagging sensation of inferiority that would disappear with the possession of really satisfactory merchandise. You see," he said, smiling at her, "that in our small way we will all be contributing to the highest interests of the country." "Of course, on a sound business basis," put in his wife. "Oh, of course, on a sound business basis," repeated the proprietor of the store. The three shook hands on it with unanimity. End of section 18. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 19. With her materials and patterns laid out on the dining room table, Mattie Farnham was trying to cut out a dress for her Margaret, an undertaking which was going jerkily because of the arrival seriatim of the children from school. They came in at different times, as suited their different ages and their rank in the hierarchy of grades. Little Jim in the first grade was free at 2, Lauren in the fourth was turned loose at 3, and Margaret and Ellen appeared soon after 4. The hour of the arrival varied, but the manner was identical: a clatter of hurried feet on the porch, the bursting open of the door, and the questing yell of "Mother! Mother!" Mattie always answered with an "Ooh-hoo" on 2 notes, adding "in the dining room," but she never waited for them to come find her. She always laid down her work and all thought of it, and hastened to give the returned wanderer a hug and kiss, and run an anxious eye over his aspect to see what had happened to him during his day out in the world. "Jimmy, you look tired. Did you eat your lunch good? Come on with me and get a piece of bread and butter." "Say, Mother, teacher picked me out to say the good morning greeting to the whole school this morning at assembly." "Did she? Which one did you say? Weren't you scared? Say it to me. Let's hear." A half an hour later they would still be in the pantry, Jimmy swinging his legs from his mother's cushiony lap, telling her between mouthfuls about everything that had happened in the long interval since he had seen her last. Mattie listened eagerly, stroking the hair back from the square white forehead, gloating greedily over the changing expressions on the little open rosy face. Then Jimmy wanted to know what she was doing, and trotted back with her to the dining room, and had to have the nature of patterns explained to him, and hung over her as she worked, rumpling up the paper and getting in her way, his tongue and hers flying together. And somehow it was time for Lauren. Wherever had that last hour gone to? The crash of the opening door, the shrill whoop of "Mother! Mother!" and it all began again, this time with an exciting account of how teacher gave Morton Cummings the awfulest calling down you ever heard for copying off of Sadie Bennett's paper. Both Jimmy and Mother were spellbound. But Margaret's dress did not progress very rapidly. At 3:45 Mattie still had the sleeves to cut out, and she'd have to put her mind on them because she hadn't bought enough dimity and they would have to be pieced under the arm. "Lauren, you and Jimmy run out and play a while, won't you? That's good, boys. Mother's got to get this done." Mercy, Evangeline Knapp would have had that dress all cut out and basted up. And then, right out of a clear sky, came the unheralded thunderbolt of a new idea. How could it have come like that? She had not thought of the Knapps, not once all day. She had been wrapped up in her work and in the children. Yet the minute she thought of Eva's name, it was all there, as though she had been studying over them for weeks. Everything in her head had shucked together, different, like when you look in a kaleidoscope and give it a shake and there's a new design. Why? Why? One thing after another came to her. How could it be she had never thought of it before? It was so plain now. Why, yes. The inquiring shout of Margaret and Ellen had no response. Surprised and aggrieved, they pushed on hastily in search of their mother, and found her dropped into a chair by the dining-room table, her big scissors in her hand, her eyes wide and fixed. She answered them absently. She hardly looked at them. She never noticed that Ellen had lost her hair ribbon. She interrupted Margaret's account of how Maria Elwell's petticoat had come off by jumping up and saying suddenly, as though she didn't even know that Margaret was talking, "See here, girls, I've got to run over to your Uncle Lester's for something. You keep an eye on Jimmy, will you?" What was the matter with Mother, anyhow? Margaret and Ellen asked themselves over their 4 o'clock pieces of gingerbread. But they were not much worried. There was never very much the matter with Mother. She hurried so that she was puffing as she went up the porch steps of the Knapp house. And yet when she opened the door, She did not know why she had come, nor what to say. Henry and Helen were just in also, enjoying cookies and milk and telling their father about the events of the day. The sight of the cookies gave Mattie her cue. "Do those spice cookies agree with Henry?" she asked. "Sure they do," said Lester. "Everything does nowadays. Henry seems to have grown right out of that weak stomach of his. He eats like a wolf, I tell him. The doctor says they do sometimes outgrow those childish things as they get near their teens." "Oh yes, as they get near their teens," said Mattie. A moment later she asked, "Helen, aren't you fatter than you used to be? Seems as though you were lots fuller in the face." "Did you just get around to noticing that, Aunt Mattie?" said Helen, laughing. "You ought to see me trying to get into last summer's dress. They don't come together. My, there's that much of a gap." She showed with her hands how wide a gap it was. "Helen has put on 8 pounds," explained Lester. "The school nurse says all the children are gaining like everything now that they serve milk at recess time." "Oh yes, milk at recess time," said Aunt Mattie. Helen and Henry finished their cookies and tore out to inspect their poultry. The children and Lester had gone into the chicken business on a small scale and were raising some brooder chicks in a packing-case chicken house in the backyard. Stephen was there already, hanging over the low wire netting, watching their tail feathers grow, as he said. Lester quoted this as he wheeled himself to the open door, where Mattie stood looking out at the children, fussing maternally over the little peeping yellow balls. "Honest to goodness, Mattie, their tail and wing feathers do come in so fast you can see them grow." He added, "I'm watching feathers grow, too. Stephen is fairly sprouting wings, he's so good. It's because he can play out of doors again, I suppose, after the winter. We've had such lovely weather of late." "Yes, it must be because he can play out of doors again," said Aunt Mattie. As they turned back into the kitchen, where a batch of bread was ready to be put into the oven, she asked, "Lester, aren't you better of your indigestion lately?" "Shh," he warned her whimsically, his finger at his lips. "Don't mention it aloud. I haven't had any in months, but I don't want it spoken about. Leave sleeping dogs lie. The doctor always said it was nervous, you know. I don't know much about the geography of my innards, but I've thought once or twice that maybe that awful shake-up my nervous system got might have sorted things over into the right pile as far as digestion goes. It's not, however," he said, with a sudden grim black look at his paralyzed legs, "a cure for indigestion that I could recommend." The tears sprang into Mattie's eyes as she turned her face away. "It's pretty hard." "Oh, I don't pretend it's any picnic, but it's of no consequence, of course." He was able to say this with a bare and utter sincerity. "Look here, Lester," she broke out. "Why couldn't you... I don't believe but what you could go and be a professor somewhere, in a university or a high school. Professors don't have to walk around. And you've always set such store by poetry and books and everything. There can't be anybody who's more..." Lester broke in with a laugh at her absurdity. "Why, you dear old girl, you don't know what you're talking about. I'd make a mess of what they want in a school, just as much as at a store. What makes you think colleges want teachers who love literature? They want somebody who can make young people sit still and listen whether they feel like it or not. They want somebody who can keep order in a classroom and drill students on dates so they can pass examinations. I couldn't do that. And I'd loathe forcing literature down the throats of boys and girls who didn't want it, as I'd loathe selling things to people who didn't need them. I'd be just a dead loss at it the way I always am." Seeing that she did not follow this, he added concretely, "Besides, I could no more get a job without all the right certificates than I could set up shop as a doctor. Nowadays colleges want you to be a Ph.D., and there isn't a Crossroads high school that would look at a man who had only 3 years in a state university 15 years ago and had been making a failure of keeping accounts in a department store ever since." Mattie recognized the irrefutable nature of all this. "Yes, I see," she said sadly. "Isn't Mattie the ignorant, impractical old infant?" thought Lester. She got up now with a long breath and silently took herself off. Although it was long past time to start supper, she did not go home. She went straight down to Willing's, and into the cloak and suits. Eva was busy with customers as usual. Everybody wants Eva to wait on them, thought Mattie, sitting down heavily. Her eyes were fixed on Evangeline. What a splendid woman she was. And now that she had some money to spend on her clothes, what a stylish-looking woman. There wasn't anybody in town could hold a candle to her. Mattie made these reflections automatically. These were always the first thoughts which came to her when she saw Eva. But today, ravaged as she was by this new perception, in which she was so all alone, her mind dwelt little on style. What she saw today was Eva's face, alert, interested, sympathetic, and Eva's eyes, which had always had, so Mattie remembered, a sort of wild look, now so shining and quiet, looking from the suits she was showing to her customers. They were a couple of women from out in the country, elderly mother and grown-up daughter. Mattie was too far off to hear what was said, but she understood perfectly from the pantomime and from the expressions of the three faces what the situation was. The two women had thrown themselves on Eva's taste to help them make up their minds, and Eva, looking at them intently, was putting herself wholeheartedly in their places so that she could give them her best judgment. How happy she looked! As she watched, a lump came into Mattie's throat, and she felt her eyes hot and misty. What in time was the matter with her? She swallowed hard and looked away and tried to think of something else, but she could not. Lester and Stephen and Henry and Helen and Eva came and stood before her eyes, her opened eyes. My goodness, I mustn't get to crying here in the store, she thought, alarmed, starting up and going to the window. When she turned around, Eva's customers had made their decision, a momentous one, judging from the relief on their faces. The three women were chatting and smiling together, relaxed and cheerful. Mattie heard Eva say, "I know you'll take the greatest comfort in it." She went with her customers to the head of the stairs, talking like an old friend. They shook hands with her, respectfully, cordially. Then she turned around and came almost running back towards Mattie. "Mattie, I've got something to tell you," she said hurriedly, smiling. She looked around her to make sure no one was near and lowered her voice. "Miss Flynn's niece has died and leaves 4 little children, and their father wants Miss Flynn, he hasn't got any relative of his own, to go and bring the children up and keep house for him. He's in the greenhouse business in Cleveland, plenty of money, and she's going." Mattie did not understand this. She understood few things at once. She saw nothing but Eva's curving, smiling lips and bright, shining eyes. She understood them with no difficulty. "Don't you see," whispered Eva, "somebody's going to be moved up to her place, head of the department. They're going to give me a try at it. Aren't they good? Mattie, it's $3,000 a year and a bonus for extra sales. And such fascinating work. I'm wild to get my hands on it and see what I can do with the sales girls. Oh, Mattie, we can begin to lay by a little something every month for the children's college. Perhaps we can buy a Ford that Lester can get out in with the children. Oh, Mattie." At this, Mattie disgraced herself and showed once more, as she said apologetically, what an idiot she was, by bursting into senseless tears and having to be carried off in haste to the toilet room to cold water and smelling salts. "I've felt all squimbly this whole afternoon," she explained, blowing her nose. "I don't know what's the matter with me. Old fool, I guess." "Well, it almost makes me feel like crying myself," said Eva, holding out a glass of water to her. "It's come so soon, so much sooner than I dared to hope, and it will mean so much to Lester and the children. They'd never have had a college education any other way. Why, Mattie, I've kept thinking all day about the hymn, 'God moves in mysterious way, his—'" "Oh, don't," said Mattie huskily. "You'll get me started again." "Of course," Eva said now, "it is dreadfully hard for a mother to be separated from her—" Mattie broke in hastily, as if to change the subject. "Eva, how is that eczema of yours lately?" Mrs. Knapp rolled up a fashionably wide sleeve and showed a clean white upper arm. "Dr. Merritt finally found a cure," she said, "a new kind of ointment he heard about at a medical convention. It's worked like a charm. I haven't had a touch of eczema, why, in I don't know when." It took the doctor long enough to get around to it, but he finally did. It was 5:30 when Mrs. Farnham left the store, but still she did not start home. Let them wait for supper, she thought desperately. What was supper compared to some other things? She hurried heavily along toward Dr. Merritt's house, hoping to goodness he would be in. He was, sitting on the porch, reading the evening paper. "Hello, Mrs. Farnham," he said, surprised to see her. "I didn't think I'd ever get any business out of your family. Who's broken a leg?" "We're all right," she told him. "I wanted to ask you about the Knapps. You know I'm sort of related to Mr. Knapp. I've been wondering what you really thought about him, whether he'll ever be cured, I mean." The doctor noticed that her voice trembled as she spoke. What a good-hearted creature she was, taking other people's troubles so to heart. He hesitated. It was not at all his habit to talk about his patients to outsiders, least of all to any such chatterbox as Mrs. Farnham. But he had thought, several times lately, that if Lester Knapp were to make any progress, he would need to start a campaign to dry up the gushing spring of family sympathy. He knew all about that sort of campaign from much experience, but he was never resigned to the necessity for it. "Darn families and their sympathy," he often said impatiently. "They, poor Charlie and poor Mary, more sick people into their graves than we doctors do." He had long suspected that the well-meaning Mrs. Farnham did a good deal of poor Lestering at the Knapps. Maybe this was a chance to head her off, to get her mind started along a new track. Of course, he must remember to use the simplest, most elementary language with her. She was really almost an illiterate. "I'll tell you, Mrs. Farnham, just what I think about the case. As far as I can make out, the effusion of blood within the spinal canal has been safely absorbed, or nearly so. There seems to be no displacement or injury to the spinal bones. There is no wasting away of the muscles, as would be the case if the spinal cord were injured. There is, I believe, good reason to hope that the loss of power in his legs is a sequel of organic conditions which have now passed away. The case now needs a psychic treatment rather than a mechanical." "Organic?" said Mrs. Farnham faintly. The word made her think of church. "I mean that, in my opinion, no physical lesion now exists, in spite of the abnormal sensations which Mr. Knapp still feels. We must try toning up the general health, overcoming the shock to his nervous system. As soon as the weather permits, I shall try heliotherapy." Mrs. Farnham caught her breath. "That is, treatment of the affected areas by direct exposure to sunlight. They have done wonderful things in France with that treatment, in just this sort of trouble. And of course, at any time, any sort of sudden nervous stimulus might do the business. You see, Mrs. Farnham, Mr. Knapp's case is now like that of the people who are cured at Lourdes or by Coué, the very same sort of phenomenon." "I don't understand very well," said Mattie humbly. "What I wanted to know was," her voice faltered, "do you think you can cure him?" "Isn't she the dumbbell?" thought the doctor. He went on aloud, hoping she would repeat his words to Mrs. Knapp. "Don't you say anything about it, Mrs. Farnham, especially to Mrs. Knapp. I don't want to crow till we are out of the woods. I wouldn't say anything to you if you were not a relative, and a sensible woman. I don't want them to have a breath of it for fear of disappointment." How strangely she was looking at him, her face so white and anxious. He brought it out roundly. "Yes, Mrs. Farnham, just between us, I really believe I can cure him." She gave a low cry that was like a wail. "Oh, doctor!" she cried, appalled, staring at him. What was the matter with the woman now? He stared back at her blankly, startled, entirely at a loss. Another look came into her eyes, an imploring look. She clasped her hands beseechingly. "Oh, doctor," she begged him in a quavering voice. From her eyes, from her voice, from her beseeching attitude, from her trembling hands, he took in her meaning. Took it in with a tingling shock of surprise at first. And then, with a deep recognition of it as something he had known all along. She saw the expression change in his face, saw the blank look go out of his eyes, saw the understanding look come in. It was a long, rich interchange of meanings that took place as they sat staring hard at each other. The gaunt, middle-aged man, no longer merely a doctor, the dull, middle-aged woman, transfigured to essential wisdom by the divination of her loving heart. Profound and human things passed from one to the other. Mattie heard someone stirring in the house. I must go, she said groaningly. She limped down the path. Her feet were aching like the toothache with the haste of her expeditions that afternoon. Half an hour later, they had to come out and call the doctor into supper, fairly to shout in his ear, he was so sunk in his thoughts, the evening paper lying unread across his knees. "Mercy me, didn't you hear the supper bell?" cried his wife. "It's been ringing like anything." End of section 19. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 20. On the evening of the day when Mrs. Knapp was informed that she would be put in Miss Flynn's place, Helen and her father celebrated by making an omelet with asparagus tips, Mother's favorite supper dish, and Henry was sent scurrying out to bring back a brick of mixed vanilla and chocolate from Angelotti's ice cream parlor. They did not play whist that evening. They just sat around and talked it over, and admired Mother, and heard again and again about the thrice-blessed events in the family of Miss Flynn's niece, which led to her retirement. "Of course it's terribly, terribly sad," Mother reminded them. "Those poor little children left without their mother. Nothing can ever make up to them for such a loss." But this decent observation cast no shade over the rejoicings. Miss Flynn was but a remote and disagreeable legend to the children, and she had been a particular bête noire for Lester in the old days. And as for her utterly unknown niece, no, Mother could not make that shadowy death cast anything but sunshine into their lives. They went on planning all the more energetically about the things they could do if they could have a Ford and go off to the country together for picnics on Sundays, even Father. They talked about which college Helen would like to attend. They talked about which kind of bicycle Henry liked the best. The children joined in the talk till 9 o'clock, and long after they were in bed with their lights out, they could hear the distant murmur of Father's and Mother's voices going on planning, such a friendly, cheerful, easy sort of murmur. Helen could not remember when she had ever heard Father and Mother talk together like that. It was like music in her ears. The last thought she had before she fell asleep was, "I am so happy. I never was so happy." Her mother fell asleep on the same thought. Apparently the excitement of it was too much for her, for she woke up suddenly to hear the clock strike 3, and found she could not get to sleep again, because at once, in a joyful confusion, her mind was filled with a rush of happy thoughts. I am to have Miss Flynn's place, $3,000 a year, and a bonus. In a year or so I ought to be making $4,000. $4,000. They had never had more than $1,800. Her thoughts vibrated happily between plans of what they could do here at the house and plans of what she would do in the reorganization of the department at the store. For some time, as she lay awake, her mind was as active and concrete and concentrated on her work as ever in the store. She was planning a system of postcard notices to customers when something especially suited to one or another came in. "Dear Mrs. Russell, among the new things in the department which have just come in from New York are some smocked, handmade children's dresses that look exactly like your little Marjorie. Dear Miss Perlman, do you remember that suit you did not buy because of the horizontal trimming on the skirt? Mr. Willing found in New York last week the same suit without that line. I am laying it aside till you can drop in to look at it." She wondered if she could let her salesgirls send out such cards too. No, it must be done with great discretion. Above all, it must not seem too urgent. People didn't like to feel that they were being hunted down. She stepped about mentally among the innumerable details of her plans, with her usual orderly mastery of them, her usual animated interest in them, her usual unquestioning acceptance of them as important. From them she went on to plans for a series of educational talks to her salesgirls about the fabrics and styles and fine points of their merchandise. She wished she could do the same thing for the girls in the ladies' waist and sweater department. There were some bright girls there, but so ignorant of their business. They'd pick it up in no time if they had the chance, if they were allowed to. Why, with a tremor all over her, she wondered if sometime she might not be only head of her own department, but superintendent for all that floor. By a flash of prescience, she suddenly knew, as she lay there alone in the quiet, that the road to advancement lay open before her, that she could step along surely and steadily to success, and take her dearly loved children with her, working for them with all her might, profoundly thankful to be able to give them what she had always so tragically and impotently wished them to have. The wideness of this thought, the blackness of the night, the unwanted prone passivity of her energetic body, all wrought upon her to a strange softness of mood. She felt almost like a girl again, dreaming. And that made her think of Lester. He had been in her mind more than usual of late, as she had learned more about the lives of the other women employed in the store. She was one of the older employees, and almost at once the younger women had leaned on her, turned to her with confidences, and asked her advice, as the women of her church had always done. But these were rougher, rawer lives into which she now looked. That haggard-eyed Mrs. Hemp in the kitchenware department. What a horrible picture she had drawn of her relations with her husband. "He's going with one of the girls in the collar factory now, Mrs. Knapp. I wouldn't put up with it a minute if it weren't for the children. That man was unfaithful to me, Mrs. Knapp, 6 months after we were married, and my first baby on the way. And it's been a new girl for him ever since, whenever he got tired of the old one." And Margaret Donahue, she that read novels on the sly, but never would look at a man, what had she said? "They make me sick," she declared briefly, with an expression on her young face which Mrs. Knapp would have given a good deal not to have seen. "I'd no more let a man come near me than a toad. I've seen too much of what Papa does to Mama." And the woman who scrubbed the floors, that evening she had come to beg Mrs. Knapp to let her sleep at the store, under a counter, in the toilet room, anywhere, just so she would not have to go home. "You're a married woman yourself, Mrs. Knapp," she had said. "You know what men are like. Judd is in one of his crazy spells. I'm afraid to go home till he gets over it. Honest, I am, Mrs. Knapp. Let me stay here. I don't care where. I'll sit up all night in a chair, if only you'll let me stay." Eva had brought her home and let her sleep on a mattress on the floor in her own room. She had felt an intense, horrified pity for her. But she had hated her for that phrase, "You are a married woman, Mrs. Knapp. You know what men are like." Did she think for a moment that Lester Knapp was that kind of a brute? Couldn't she see by looking at him that he was a million times too fine to... She hated the woman again tonight as she thought of it, and the thought brought up before her all that Lester had been to her. No woman could have better reason than she to trust the delicacy, the warm loving-heartedness, the self-control, the innate decency of a man. They had been married for 14 years, and from the sweet, sweet early days of their young honeymoon, when, ignorant and innocent both of them, they had stumbled their way towards each other, she had never known a single instant of this poisonous atmosphere of suspicion and hate and endured violence which these other women apparently took for granted as the inevitable relationship of husband and wife. How good Lester had been to her. She had not appreciated it. She had not really thought of it. It had never occurred to her that he might be anything else. And how good to the children. Never an impatient word like most men. He was the best father in the world. Not another man she knew could have endured to be so shut up with the children. How faithfully he had tried to take her place now that she could not be in her rightful position with them. What lovely memories the children would have of their father always. Was it possible he was of the same flesh and blood as Ellen O'Hearn's father, who never, so Ellen said, passed one of his children without aiming a blow at it? The overflowing of this affection for Lester, which had been slowly rising for weeks. Her deep thankfulness for what she would be able to do for the children. She found herself trembling in her bed. She felt an impulsive longing to share her emotion with Lester, to put her arms about his neck and let him know that she did not take his loyalty, his gentleness, his faithfulness, his fineness so coldly for granted as she had seemed. She had been so unhappy about their hideous poverty, that was all. It was abominable to be poor. It brought out the worst in everyone. When you were distracted with worry about money, you simply weren't yourself. Warm and flushed, she sprang out of bed, lighted a candle, and went softly downstairs in her slippered feet. Neither Lester nor Stephen woke as she went into the room, and she stood for an instant gazing down at them. Stephen was beautiful and strong, sleeping with both rounded arms flung up over his head. Lester was looking almost like a boy in the abandon of his sleep, like the fine, true-hearted, sensitive boy to whom she had given herself as a girl. But that boy had been vibrant with life from his head to his heels, and now half of his body lay dead. From the first it had been appalling to Evangeline to see that helpless, frozen immobility. How splendidly he had endured it without a complaint. But she had seen from his eagerness tonight, as they talked of the possibility of having a Ford, how imprisoned he had felt, how wild with pleasure it made him to think he would be able to get out of these four walls. She would never have been as patient as he. If she had been condemned to that death in life of half her body, not able even to turn over in bed without waking up to a nightmare of struggle, her legs like so much stone. Had she made a sound? Had the light of the candle disturbed him a little? Without waking, Lester drew a long breath, turned over easily in bed, drew up his knees with a natural, flexible motion, threw his arm out over the covers, and dropped off to profound sleep once more. Everybody at the store was sure the next day that Mrs. Knapp was coming down with some serious malady. She was not only extremely pale and shaken by shivers that ran all over her. It was worse. She had a look of death-like sickness that frightened the girls in her department. They sent for Mr. Willing to come. When he did, he gave one look at Mrs. Knapp's pinched face and stooped shoulders, and ordered her home at once. "You're coming down with the flu, Mrs. Knapp. Everybody's having it. Now, it doesn't amount to anything this year if you take it quick, but it's foolishness to try to keep on your feet. You get right home, take some quinine and some aspirin, and give yourself a sweat. You'll be all right, but don't wait a minute." Without a word, Mrs. Knapp put on her wraps and went out of the store. She did not turn homeward. She dared not go home and face Lester and the children till she had wrestled with those awful questions and had either answered them or been killed by them. Where could she go to be alone? She decided that she would walk straight ahead of her out into the country. No, that would not do. Everybody knew her. They would comment on it. They would ask her questions. She felt that she would burst into shrieks if anyone asked her a question just then. As she hesitated, she saw over the roofs of the houses the spire of St. Peter's pointing upward, and with a rush her heart turned towards the quiet and solitude of the church. Thank heaven it was always kept open. She hurried down a side street, and, pushing open the heavy door, stumbled forward into the hushed, dusky, empty building. She felt her way to the nearest pew, knelt down, and folded her hands as if to pray. She tried with all her might to pray, but could not. The raging unrest and turmoil in her heart rose up in clashing waves and filled the church with its clamor. It was in vain that she tried to combat it with odds and ends of prayers, which came into her mind with the contact of the pew, with the familiar atmosphere of church. Almighty and most merciful Father, Lester was better. O God, who art the author of peace and lover of concord, Lester would get well. God, be merciful to us and bless us and show us the... And then, no! She cried aloud, passionately, and pressed her trembling hands over her mouth, frightened. She was a wicked woman. God be merciful to me, a sinner. She had no heart. She did not want her husband to get well. She did not want to go home and live with her children. But she must. There was no other way. Like a person shut up suddenly in an airless prison, she ran frantically from one locked door to another, beating her hands on them, finding them sullenly strong, not even shaken on their cruel steel hinges as she flung herself against them. If Lester got well, of course he could not stay at home and keep house and take care of the children. No able-bodied man ever did that. What would people say? It was out of the question. People would laugh at Lester. They would laugh at her. They would not admire her any more. What would people say if she did not go back at once to the children? She who had always been so devoted to them. She whom people pitied now because she was forced to be separated from them. Everyone had heard her say how hard it was for a mother to be separated from her. For one instant, an instant she never forgot, Evangeline knew, for the first, the only time in her life, a gust of cold, deadly contempt for herself. It nearly killed her. She who had tried so hard all her life to keep her self-respect. She who had been willing to pay any price so that in her own eyes she might be always in the right. Yes, it nearly killed her. But it did not reconcile her to the inevitable, nor bow her spirit in resignation. Never before had she been asked to pay any such price as this. She couldn't. She stood stock still in her prison cell and wrung her hands in revolt. She simply could not. After having known something else, she could not go back to the narrow, sordid round of struggle with intolerable, ever-renewed drudgery, to the daily, hourly contact with the children's forgetfulness, carelessness, foolishness, to Stephen's horrible tempers, with no outlet, no future, poverty for them all, always. Poverty. It came down suffocatingly over her head like a smothering blanket thrown and twisted hard by an assailant who had sprung upon her out of the dark. She had thought herself safe from that long, slow starvation. To go back to it, to the raging, helpless narrowness of an income tragically too small, to rise up and lie down with that leaden care, to drag it about all day like a ball and chain. She could never endure it now that she knew that it was not in the least inevitable, knew how easy it was to avoid it, knew that if Lester were only willing to care a little more, to try a little harder, to put his mind on it really and truly, to give his heart to it as she did. All her old burning impatience with Lester was there, boiling up in clouds from the cauldron of her heart. Through those turbid clouds she had a glimpse of a woman, touched and moved, standing by a man's bedside and blessing him silently for his faithfulness, his gentleness, his fineness. But those figures were far away, flat and unreal, like something in a made-up picture. They were but an added irritation. She hated the thought of them as a creature in flames would hate the recollection of a running brook. Poverty, isolation, monotony, stagnation, killing depression over never-ending servile tasks. Poverty. There was no way out. She knew that now. But she could not endure it. She never could endure it again. She would hate Lester. She would kill herself and the children. She had sunk lower and lower, till now she was crouching in a heap, panting, her bent arms over her face as if beaten down by relentless blows which she could no longer even try to parry. What could she do? Her native energy rose up blindly, staggering, like a courageous fighter who has been knocked out but does not know it. What could she do? With a terrible effort, she strove to rise to a higher level than this mere brute suffering. She tried. Yes, she really tried for a moment to think what was the right thing to do. She tried again to pray, to ask God to show her what was the right thing for a good woman to do. But she could not pray. Grant, O Lord, I beseech thee, pour into our hearts such... No, she could not pray. She could not command her mind to any such coherence as prayer. Whirling snatches of the thoughts which had filled her mind incessantly since the night before were blown across her attention like birds driven before a tornado. The place for a mother is with her children. How many times she had heard that, and said it. She was a bad woman to rebel so against it. And it would do her no good to rebel. What else could she do? Around and around the cell she tore, beating her hands on those locked doors. Someone had to stay and keep house and take care of the children and make the home. And if Lester were cured, he couldn't. No able-bodied man could do such work, of course. Nobody ever heard of such a thing. Men had to make the living. What would people say? They would laugh. They would make fun of the children, and of Lester, and of her. They would think of course she ought to want to do it. Everyone had heard her say how hard it was for a... And they couldn't go away to another city, somewhere else, where no one knew them. Her one chance was here. But all at once, with a final roar, the tumult swept off and went beating its way into the distance, out of the church and her heart. There was a dead, blank silence about her, through which there came to her a clear, neat, compact thought. But perhaps Lester will not get well. Perhaps he will not get well. A deep, bodeful hush filled her heart. It was as though she had suddenly gone deaf to all the noises of the world, to everything but that one possibility. She was straighter now, no longer crouched and panting. She was on her knees, her hands clasped, her head decently bent, in the familiar attitude of Sunday morning. At last she was praying. A moment later, she was running out of the church, as though a phantom had risen beside her and laid a skeleton hand on her shoulder. She had not been praying that Lester... No, it was not possible that she had been praying that her husband would not get well. But soon she walked more quietly, more at her usual pace. After all, she had nothing to go on, nothing to be sure of, nothing really to make her think it very likely that Lester would... End of section 20. Recording by Maria Casper. Chapter 21. One of the interests of life for Lester was the uncertainty about who was to be his mental companion for any given day. It seemed to be something over which he had no control. Sometimes he had thought it might be the weather which settled the matter. Not infrequently his first early morning look at the world told him with which great spirit he was to live that day. A clear, breezy, bird-twittering dawn after rain meant Christina Rossetti's child poems. A soft grey downpour of warm rain varnishing the grass to brilliance and beating down on the earth with a roll of muted drum notes always brought Hardy to his mind. Golden sun spilled in floods over the new green of the quivering young leaves meant Shelley. And Browning was for days when the sun rose rich and many-coloured out of confused masses of turbid clouds. But it was not always the weather. Sometimes, as he opened his eyes, his chosen comrade for the day was there beside him before he had taken in anything more of the visible world than the white vacancy of the ceiling, with those familiar blemishes, which were by this time a part of his brain. He did not always welcome the companion of the day, especially when the unseen spirit but repeated and intensified the colour of his own temperament, from which he was so glad to escape by following the trumpets and fanfare of a temperament more brightly, more vividly alive. But he had found it was of little use to try to alter the day's destiny. He could, indeed, easily enough bring to mind mechanically many others of the blessed company of articulate human beings who sang for him what he could never say for himself. But he could hear, really hear, in his deep heart's core, nothing but the appointed voice. So he resigned himself to a brooding, astringent day, when he woke up one morning, and even before he opened his eyes, heard, "But falling, 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 there's your song, the cradle song that sings you to the grave." That was no longer meant for him, Lester reflected, as he struggled with the fatiguing, humiliating problem of getting himself dressed without help. He had spent years in falling, 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 and, tiring of it, had fallen once for all. Fallen all anybody could fall, so completely that there was no more to say about it. That job was done. With a straining pull on his arms, he managed to swing and claw himself into his wheelchair and sat quiet for a moment to get his breath. Whoever would think that dead human legs could be so infernally hard to get from one place to another? They seemed to weigh more than all the rest of his body put together, he thought, as he lifted one with both hands and changed it to an easier position. He sat panting, losing for an instant his firmly held self-control, succumbing to what was always near the surface, a shamed horror of his mutilated, strengthless body. It came upon him that day with such poisonous violence that he was alarmed, and aroused himself to resist. The thing to remember, he told himself sternly and contemptuously, is that it concerns only me, and what concerns me is not of the slightest importance. I'm done for, was really done for long ago. Nothing that can happen to me matters now. He heard, as if it were a wistful voice saying, "But neither parted roads nor cent per cent may starve quite out the child that lives in us, the child that is the man, the mystery." And he replied bitterly to this, "That's all you know about it. Cent per cent can starve it, dead, dead. It turned the trick for me all right." Well, no funeral orations over it anyhow, he told himself. If it got starved, that's a sign it deserved to starve, that it didn't have the necessary pep to hustle around and get its food. All that can be annihilated must be annihilated, that the children of Jerusalem may be saved from slavery. But he knew that he did not really believe this clean, trenchant ruthlessness, and he cursed himself out for the sniveling sentimentality which he could not kill. Then Stephen turned over and opened his eyes. Why, there was father up and dressed already. He scrambled hastily to his knees. "You didn't lace your shoes, did you?" he cried, roughly and threateningly. That was a service to father which he had taken for his very own. He would have killed Henry or Helen if they had dared to do it. "No, old man, I didn't lace my shoes," said father, smiling at him, "for the very good reason that I can't. I couldn't get along without the services of my valet." Stephen looked relieved, slid out of bed, sat down on the floor, and began to pull the laces up. Once he looked up at his father and smiled. He loved to do this for father. That evening was the second time in succession that Evangeline went to bed directly after supper. She said she was trying to stave off an attack of influenza with extra sleep and doses of quinine. Lester and the children did not play whist when mother was not there, neither when she was tired and went to bed early, nor when she stayed down in the store evenings taking stock or working over newly arrived goods with Mr. and Mrs. Willing. Whist was connected with mother, and although she often told them that they need not lose the evenings when she could not be there, and would enjoy playing with Dummy for a change, they never got the cards out unless she was with them. Father usually read aloud to them on such evenings, and they wouldn't have missed that for anything. That evening he read a rhymed, funny story about a farmer who got blown away from his barn one winter night, and with his lantern waving, slid 2 miles down the mountain before he could stop himself. This was a great favorite of theirs, and made them laugh harder every time they heard it. Sometimes he came with arms outspread, like wings revolving in the scene upon his longer axis, and with no small dignity of mien. Faster or slower as he chanced, sitting or standing as he chose, according as he feared to risk his neck or thought to spare his clothes. And Helen liked the end, too, that father always brought out with a special accent, the way the farmer didn't give up. As he started silently and doggedly back the long way around, miles and miles in the cold, she walked along beside him, sharing something of his quiet resistance to fate. That was the way to do when you had slid all the way out of the way you wanted to go. Father read another one after that, about a bonfire, which, although she did not quite understand it all, always made Helen tremble with excitement. Henry did not understand any of it, and did not try to. It never bothered him now when he did not understand the poems father read to Helen. He just stopped listening, and played with his puppy's ear, and lost himself in the warm, soft heaviness of the puppy's little sprawling body on his knees. Sometimes he put his face lovingly down on the little dog's head, his heart melting with tenderness. He needed no poetry out of a book. It will have roared first, and mixed sparks with stars, and sweeping round it with a flaming sword, made the dim trees stand back in wider circles. "Oh," cried Helen, loving the sound of the words just as Henry loved his puppy, "isn't that just scrumptious?" The breezes were so spent with winter blowing, they seemed to fail the bluebirds under them short of the perch their languid flight was towards, and my flame made a pinnacle to heaven. "Oh, Father," said Helen, wiggling on her chair with delight, "isn't it too lovely?" And then, in a passion of longing, "Oh, I wish I could write like that." Something in the expression of her father's face struck her. She was only 13, but an older intuition from her coming womanhood made her say impulsively, with all her heart, "Father, you love it so. Why don't you? Didn't you ever try to write poetry, too?" To her confusion, a slow, deep flush mounted all over her father's face. He looked down at the book in silence. Helen was as horrified as if she had flung open the door of a secret sanctuary in a temple. She jumped up from the sofa, and, not understanding her father, nor herself, nor what she was doing, "Oh, Father dear," she murmured, her arms around his neck. Henry and the puppy looked up at them sleepily. "Is it bedtime?" asked Henry. Helen went to sleep that night still feeling the great hug Father had given her. She had never felt Father loved her so much before. Downstairs, before he went to bed, her father, turning over the pages of a book, was reading, "And nothing to look backward to with pride, and nothing to look forward to with hope." "Come, come," he said to himself. "Terence, this is stupid stuff. You eat your victuals fast enough. We'll have to call this day one of our failures. I'd better get it over with and start another." His heart was still bleeding to the old wound he had thought healed and forgotten for years, which Helen's sudden question had torn open. Good heavens, weren't you safe from those old buried griefs until you were actually under the sod? And yet, mingled with the old bitterness was a new sweetness, Helen's sympathy, Helen's understanding. It had never occurred to him before that children could give something as well as take all, the all he was so thankful to give them. Why, he thought wistfully, Helen might be the companion he had never had. He shook his head. No, that would not be fair to her. No dead hand business. She must find her companions in her own generation. He must be ready to stand aside and let her pass on when the time came. That new sweetness was offered to him only that he might learn to make another renunciation. He looked about him to see if there was anything to be done for the house before he went to bed. "Shall I close that window over there?" he thought to himself. "No, the night is warm. It will give us more air." He wheeled himself to the closed door of the dining room, opened it, and perceived that the wind was blowing hard from the other direction, for a strong draught instantly sucked past him between the open window back of him and the open window at the head of Stephen's bed. He felt the gust, and saw the long light curtain curl eddying out towards him over the flicker of Stephen's bedside candle. It caught in an instant. It flared up like gun-cotton all over its surface. It came dropping down, horribly dropping down towards Stephen's unconscious, upturned face. Flames on that tender flesh? Stephen's father found himself standing by the bed, snatching the curtain to one side, crushing out the flames between his hands. His wheelchair still stood by the open door. The draught between the two open windows now blew out the candle abruptly. In the darkness the door slammed shut with a loud report. But the room was not dark to Lester. As actually as he had seen and felt the burst of flame from the curtain, he now felt himself flare up in physical ecstasy to be standing on his own feet, to know that he had taken a dozen steps, to know that he was no longer a half-man, a mutilated wreck from whom normal people averted their eyes, in what they called pity, but what was really contempt and disgust. He was like a man who has been shut in a cage too low for him to stand, who has crouched and stooped and bowed his shoulders, and who suddenly is set free to rise up to his full stature, to throw his arms up over his head. The relief from oppression was as rending as a pain. It was 1,000 times more joyful than any joy he had ever known. His self, his ego, savagely, grimly, harshly beaten down as it had been, sprang up with an exultant yell. The flame of its exultation flared up like gun cotton as the curtain had flared, and died down as quickly, crushed and ground to blackness between giant hands that snatched it to one side as it dropped down toward Stephen's unconscious, upturned face. Flames on that tender flesh? Lester knew nothing but that there was blackness within and without him. He was lying, fully dressed, across the foot of his bed. His face was buried in the bedclothes, but it was no blacker there than in the room, in his heart. What made it so black? He did not know. He was beyond thought. He was nothing but wild, quivering apprehension, as he had been in that instant when, poised on the icy roof, he had turned to hurl himself down into the void. The terror of that instant was with him again. What fall was before him now? He went a little insane as he lay there on the bed. He seemed to himself to be falling, as he had fallen so many times during his convalescence, endlessly, in a dread that grew worse, because now he knew what unutterable anguish awaited him. He shuddered, grasped the blanket, and tore at it savagely, wondering madly what it was. He came to himself with a great start that shook him, that shook the bed so that it rattled in the dark, silent room. He sat up and wiped his face that was dripping wet. Now what? His mind was lucid. He was not falling. He was on his bed, in his room, with Stephen sleeping beside him in the darkness. And he knew now that he could get well. Well, what was he to do now that he knew he could get well? He knew beforehand that there was nothing he could do. Life had once more cast him out from the organization of things. Could he do any better than before, his miserable, poorly done, detested work? Could he hate it any less? No, he would hate it 1,000 times more, now that he knew that it was not only a collaboration with materialism fatly triumphant, but that it kept him from his real work. Vital, living, creative work. Work he could do as no one else could. Work that meant the salvation of his own children. Could he sit again sunk in that treacherous bog of slavery to possessions, doing his share of beckoning unsuspecting women into it, and all the time know that perhaps, at that very minute, Helen was repressing timidly some sweet, shy impulse that would fester in her heart when it might have blossomed into fragrance in the sun. It would drive him mad to see again in Helen's eyes that old, stupid, crushed expression of self-distrustful discouragement which he had always thought was the natural expression of her nature. He thought of Henry, leaping and running with his dog, both of them casting off sparkling rays of youth as they capered. He thought of Henry, ghastly white, shrunken, emptied of vitality, as he lay on the bed that last evening of the old life, in the condition which they had all thought was the inevitable one for Henry. And Eva. He gave a deep groan as he thought of Eva. Eva, who loved the very work that he hated, who took it all simple-heartedly, at the solemnly preposterous value that the world put on it, to shut that strong flying falcon into the barnyard again, to watch her rage and droop and tear at her own heart and at the children's. Solemnly, out of the darkness, as though it had been Stephen's voice reciting Little Boy Lost to him, he heard, "Father, Father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast. Speak, Father, speak to your little boy, or else I shall be lost." And there was Stephen. Lester had no words for what that name meant to him now. Nothing but a great aching sorrow, into which he sank helplessly, letting its black waves close over his head. Presently he struggled up to the air again and looked about him. There must be some way of escape. Anybody but a weakling would invent some way to save them all. He must leave nothing unthought of. He must start methodically to make the rounds of all the possibilities. He must not lose his head in this hysterical way. He must be a man and master circumstances. Would it be possible for both of them to work, he and Eva? Other parents did sometimes. The idea was that with the extra money you made, you hired somebody to take care of the children. If, before his accident, anyone had dreamed of Eva's natural gift for business, he would have thought the plan an excellent one. But it was only since his accident that he had had the faintest conception of what caring for the children might mean. Now that he had lived with the children, now that he had seen how it took all of his attention to make even a beginning of understanding them, how it took all of his intelligence and love to try to give them what they needed, spiritually and mentally. No. You could, perhaps, if you were very lucky, though it was unlikely in the extreme. It was conceivable that by paying a high cash price you might be able to hire a little intelligence, enough intelligence to give them good material care. But you could never hire intelligence sharpened by love. In other words, you could not hire a parent, and children without parents were orphans. Whom could they hire? What kind of a person would it be? He tried to think concretely of the possibilities. Why, he gave a sick, horrified laugh. Why, very likely some nice old grandmotherly soul, like Mrs. Anderson, who, so everybody would say, would be just the right person because she had so much experience with children. He clenched his hands in a murderous, animal fury at the thought of Stephen's proud, strong, vital spirit, left helpless to the vicious, vindictive meanness of a Mrs. Anderson. And from the outside, coming in late in the afternoon, with no first-hand information about what had happened during the day, how could he and Eva ever know a Mrs. Anderson from anyone else? Well, perhaps not a Mrs. Anderson. Let him think of the very best that might conceivably be possible. Perhaps a good-natured young houseworker who would be kind to the children, indulgent, gentle. He thought of the long hours during which he bent his utmost attention on the children, to understand them, to see what kind of children they were, to think what they needed most now. Not little passing pleasures, such as good nature and indulgence would suggest, but real food for what was deepest in them. He thought of how he used his close hourly contact with them as a means of looking into their minds and hearts, how he used the work in common with them as a scientist conducts an experiment station to accumulate data as material for his intelligence to arrange in order, so that his decisions might be just and far-sighted as well as loving. He thought how, in the blessed mental leisure which comes with small mechanical tasks, he pored over this data, considered it and reconsidered it in the light of some newer evidence. Where was now a good-natured young hired girl, let her be ever so indulgent and gentle? You can't hire somebody to be a parent for your children, he thought again passionately. They are born into the world asking you for bread, If you give them a stone, it were better for you that that stone were hanged about your neck and cast into the sea." Eva had no bread to give them. He saw that in this day of judgment hour, and no longer pretended that he did not. Eva had passionate love and devotion to give them, but neither patience nor understanding. There was no sacrifice in the world which she would not joyfully make for her children, except to live with them. They had tried that for 14 dreadful years, and knew what it brought them. That complacent, unquestioned generalization, the mother is the natural homemaker, what a juggernaut it had been in their case! How poor Eva, drugged by the cries of its devotees, had cast herself down under its grinding wheels, and had dragged the children in under with her. And it wasn't because Eva had not tried her best. She had nearly killed herself trying. But she had been like a gifted mathematician set to paint a picture. And he did have bread for them. He did not pretend he had not. He had found that he was in possession of miraculous loaves, which grew larger as he dealt them out. For the first time since his untried youth, Lester knew a moment of pride in himself, of satisfaction with something he had done. He thought of Henry, normal, sound, growing as a vigorous young sapling grows. He thought of Helen, opening into perfumed blossom like a young fruit tree promising a rich harvest. Of Stephen, growing as a strong man grows, purposeful, energetic, rejoicing in his strength. And loving, yes, loving. How good Stephen was to him! That melting upward look of protecting devotion when he had laced up his shoes that morning. "Father, Father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast." Well, there was the simple, obvious possibility, the natural, right, human thing to do. He could continue to stay at home and make the home, since a homemaker was needed. He knew this was impossible. The instant he tried to consider it, he knew it was as impossible as to roll away a mountain from his path with his bare hands. He knew that from the beginning of time, everything had been arranged to make that impossible. Every unit in the whole of society would join in making it impossible, from the ladies' guild to the children in the public schools. It would be easier for him to commit murder or rob a bank than to give his intelligence where it was most needed in his own home with his children. "What is your husband's business, Mrs. Knapp?" "He hasn't any. He stays at home and keeps house." Oh! He heard that "oh" reverberating infernally down every road he tried. "My papa is an insurance agent. What does your papa do for a living, Helen?" "He doesn't do anything. Mother makes the living. Father stays home with us children." "Oh, is he sick?" "No, he's not sick." Oh! He saw Helen, sensitive, defenseless Helen, cringing before that gigantic "oh." He knew that soon Henry, with his normal reactions, would learn to see that "oh" coming, to hide from it, to avoid playmates because of it. There was no sense to that "oh." There had been no sense for generations and generations. It was an exclamation that dated from the cave age, but it still had power to warp the children's lives as much as, yes, almost as much as leaving them to a Mrs. Anderson. They would be ashamed of him. He would lose his influence over them. He would be of no use to them. Over his head, tradition swung a bludgeon he knew he could not parry. He had always guessed at the presence of that tradition ruling the world, guessed that it hated him, guessed at its real name. He saw it plain now, grinning sardonically high above all the little chattering pretenses of idealism. He knew now what it decreed, that men are in the world to get possessions, to create material things, to sell them, to buy them, to transport them, above all, to stimulate to fever heat the desire for them in all human beings. It decreed that men are of worth insofar as they achieve that sort of material success, and worthless if they do not. That was the real meaning of the unctuous talk of service in the commercial textbooks which Eva read so wholeheartedly. They were intended to fix the human attention altogether on the importance of material things, to make women feel that the difference between linen and cotton is of more importance to them than the fine, difficultly drawn, always varying line between warm human love and lust, to make men feel that more possessions would enlarge their lives. Blasphemy! Blasphemy! He read as little as possible of those trade journals which Eva left lying around the house. But the other day, in kindling a fire with one, his eye had been caught by a passage, the phrases of which had fixed themselves in that sensitive verbal memory of his, and were not to be dislodged. Morally, aesthetically, emotionally, and commercially, America is helped, uplifted, advanced, by the efforts of you and me to induce individual Americans first to want and then to acquire more of the finer things of life. Take fine jewelry. It makes the purchaser a better person by its appeal to the emotional and aesthetic side of his or her nature. Desire for the rich and tasteful adornments obtainable at the jewelry store expresses itself in stronger attempts to acquire the means to purchase. This means advancement for America. Should you not, bearing this wonderful thought in mind, be enthused to broaden your contact with the buying public by increasing your distributing? They wrote that sort of thing by the yard, by the mile. And they were right. That was the real business of life, of course. He had always known it. That was why men who did other things, teachers or poets or musicians or ministers, were so heartily despised by normal people. And as for any man who might try to be a parent, why, the fanatic feminists were right, after all. Under its greasy camouflage of chivalry, society is really based on a contempt for women's work in the home. The only women who were paid, either in human respect or in money, were women who gave up their traditional job of creating harmony out of human relationships and did something really useful, bought or sold or created material objects. As for any man's giving his personality to the woman's work of trying to draw out of children the best there might be in them, fiddling foolishness, leave it to the squaws. He was sure he was the only man who had ever conceived even the possibility of such a lapse from virile self-respect as to do what all women are supposed to do. He knew well enough that other men would feel for such a conception on his part a stupefaction only equaled by their red-blooded scorn. At this he caught a passing glimpse far below the surface. He knew that it was not only scorn he would arouse, but suspicion and alarm. For an instant he understood why tradition was so intolerant of the slightest infraction of the respect due to it, why it was ready to tear him and all his into 1,000 pieces, rather than permit even one variation from its standard. It was because the variation he had conceived ran counter to the prestige of sacred possessions. Not only was it beneath the dignity of any able-bodied brave to try to show young human beings how to create rich, deep, happy lives without great material possessions, but it was subversive of the wholehearted worship due to possessions. It was heresy. It must be stopped at all costs. Lester heard the threatening snarl of that unsuspected, unquestioned tradition, amazed that anyone dared so much as to conceive of an attack on it, and he knew that he was not man enough to stand up and resist the bludgeon and the snarl. He had thought he had experienced all the possible ways in which a man can feel contempt for himself, but there was another depth before him. For he might as well have the poor merit of being honest about it, and not hide behind Eva and the children. He knew that he could stand that as little as they, that he would turn feebly sour and bitter under it, as he had before, and blame other people for what was his own lack of endurance. Let him try to imagine it for an instant, a definite instance. If he were once more an able-bodied man, what would he feel to have Harvey Bronson drop in and find him making a bed while Eva sold goods? Good God, was he such a miserable cur as to let the thought of Harvey Bronson's sneer stand between him and doing what he knew was best for the children? There they stood, infinitely precious, hungering and thirsting for what he had to give them, defenseless but for him. Would he stand back and let the opinion of the Ladies' Guild? Yes, he would. That was the kind of miserable cur he was, and now he knew it. He wiped the sweat from his face and ground his teeth together to keep them from chattering. They were chattering like those of a man cast adrift in a boat with only a broken paddle between him and the roaring leap of a cataract. The roaring was louder and louder in his ears as he felt himself helplessly drifting towards the drop. He had not been willing to look at it, had kept his eyes on the shores which he had tried so vainly to reach, struggling pitifully with his poor broken tool. Now he gave up, and, cowering in a heap, waited dumbly for the crashing downfall. He who had fallen so low, was he to fall again, lower still? He who had thought he had kept nothing at all for himself in life, must he now give up his one living treasure, his self-respect? Could it be that he was thinking, he, Lester Knapp, of shamming a sickness he did not have? Of trampling his honor deep into the filth of small daily lies? The thought carried him with a rush over the wicked gleaming curve at the edge of the abyss. He was falling. There was nothing but a formless horror of yelling whirlpools which sucked him down. Presently it was dawn. A faint gray showed at the windows. The blemishes on the ceiling came into view and stalked grimly to their accustomed stand in his brain. The night was over. Stephen lay sleeping peacefully, the harmless blackened bits of the burnt curtain scattered about his bed. "Father, father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast. Speak, father, speak to..." It was not fast he would be walking, or at all. A robin chirped sleepily in the maple. It would soon be day. Lester got up, shuffled over to his wheelchair, and sat down in it. After a time he stooped down and unlaced his shoes. Then he wheeled himself over to Stephen's bed and waited for the day to come. End of section 21. Chapter 22. Dr. Merritt had telephoned Mrs. Knapp that he was going to make some very special tests of her husband's condition that afternoon, tests which might be conclusive as to the possibility of recovery. He had chosen Sunday, he told her, because he wished her to be at home. He tried to make his voice sound weighty and warning, and he knew that he had succeeded when, on arriving at the house, he found Mrs. Farnham there, with a very sober face, twisting her handkerchief nervously in her hands. The two women looked at him in silent anxiety as he came in. He asked, with an impenetrable professional manner, to have his patient's chair rolled into the next room. It is always better to make these nerve reflex tests in perfect quiet, he explained. Mr. Knapp, with no comment, rolled his chair back into the dining room, and the doctor closed the door. In a few moments, Helen, very pale, with frightened eyes, came in to join the waiting women. She found them as pale as she, motionless in their chairs, her mother's lips trembling. She sat down on a stool beside Aunt Mattie, who patted her shoulder and said something in a tremulous whisper which Helen did not catch. From the other room, from behind the closed door, came a low murmur of voices, broken by long pauses. There was no other sound except Stephen's shout as he played with Henry's dog in the backyard. More voices from behind the closed door, very low, very restrained, a mere breath which Helen could catch only by straining her ears. She could not even be sure whether it were the doctor or father who was talking. Another long silence. Helen's heart pounded and pounded. She wished she could hide her face in Aunt Mattie's lap, but she could not move, not till she knew. Had she heard the voices again? Yes? No? There was no sound from the next room. Then, as though the doctor had been standing there all the time, his hand on the knob, the door suddenly opened. Now that the time had come, the doctor found it hard to get the words out. He could not think of any way to begin. The three waiting women looked at him, imploring him silently to end their suspense. He cleared his throat, sat down, looked in his case for something which he did not find, and shut the case with a click. As if this had been a signal, he then said hastily, in an expressionless voice, "Mrs. Knapp, I might as well be frank with you. I do not think it best to go on with the treatment I have been trying for your husband. I am convinced from the result of the tests today." His fingers played nervously with his watch chain. "I am convinced, I say, that it would be very unwise to continue making an attempt to cure this local trouble. The nervous system of the human body, you understand, is so closely interrelated that when you touch one part, you never know what. The thing which we doctors must take into consideration is the total reaction on the patient. That is the weak point with so many specialists. They consider only the immediate seat of the trouble, and not the sum total of the effect on the patient. You often hear them say of an operation that killed the patient that it was a success. And in the case of spinal trouble, like Mr. Knapp's, of course the entire nervous system is... What I have said applies, of course, very especially when it is a case of..." He saw from the strained, drawn expression on Mrs. Farnham's face that she did not understand a word he was saying, and brought out with desperate bluntness, "The fact is that it would be a waste of time for me to continue my weekly visits. I now realize that it would be very dangerous for Mr. Knapp ever to try to use his legs. Crutches, perhaps, later, but he must never be allowed to make the attempt to go without crutches. It might be..." He drew a long breath and said it. "It might be fatal." When he finished, he looked very grim and disagreeable, and opening his case once more, began to fumble among the little bottles in it. God, why did any honest man ever take up the practice of medicine? Back of him, through the open door, Lester Knapp could be seen in his wheelchair, his head fallen back on the headrest, his long face white, a resolute expression of suffering in his eyes. Mrs. Farnham began to cry softly into her handkerchief, her shoulders shaking, the sound of her muffled sobs loud in the hushed room. Mrs. Knapp had turned very white at the doctor's first words, and was silent a long time when he finished. Then she said, rather faintly, but with her usual firmness, "It is very hard, of course, for a—" She caught herself and began again. "It is very hard, of course, but we must all do the best we can." Helen tiptoed softly into the kitchen and out onto the back porch, closing the kitchen door behind her carefully. Then she took one jump from the porch to the walk and ran furiously out to the chicken yard, where Henry and Stephen were feeding the chickens. At least Stephen was feeding the chickens. Henry was looking anxiously towards the house, and the moment he saw Helen come out, started back on a run to meet her. As he ran, his shadowed face caught the light from hers. "It's all right," she told him in a loud whisper, as they came together. "The doctor says that father never can be cured, that he'll always have to go on crutches." "Oh, Helen," said Henry, catching desperately at her arm. "Are you sure? Are you sure?" His mouth began to work nervously, and he crooked his arm over his face to hide it. "What's the matter of you?" asked Stephen, running up alarmed. Helen got down on her knees and put her arms around the little boy. Her voice was trembling as she said, "Stevie, dear, father's going to stay right with us. He's never going to go away." Stephen looked at her appalled. His rosy face paled to white. "Was he going to go away from us?" he asked, horrified. "Why, of course. He'd have to go to work if the doctor could cure him. But the doctor says he can't. He says father never will—" Stephen had been glaring into her face to make sure he understood. He now pushed her from him roughly and ran at top speed towards the house. He bounded up onto the porch. He burst open the door. The house was filled with the clamor of his passionate, questing call of "Father! Father!" End of Section 22. Recording by Maria Casper. End of The Homemaker by Dorthy Canfield.